Chapter 2745, 2745 Inheritance Sword Art. 2745 Inheritance Sword Art. After dealing with the 5 sword cultivators who had just arrived to challenge him, Su Zimo returned to his cave abode. Beiming Shui had just woken up from her cultivation as well. "There are people disturbing you again, master?" Beiming Shui frowned slightly. Su Zimo smiled. "I heard that they are paragons of the other sword peaks. To think that I would cause such a huge commotion in the sword world while imparting the martial Tao to you." Over the past few days, Su Zimo gradually understood. The reason why this group of sword cultivators came to challenge him was because they could not stand him imparting the Tao to Beiming Shui and could not bear to see her suffer cruel torture. "Master, I'm sorry," Beiming Shui said. "I'll look for the Peak Master now and get him to restrain the legacy disciples of Carnage Sword Peak so that they won't disturb you all the time." "It's fine." Su Zimo waved it off and smiled. "These people are quite interesting. I'm not really affected." "Interesting?" Beiming Shui blinked in confusion. Su Zimo smiled and explained, "The cultivation environment and atmosphere of the sword world are very good. You're lucky to be able to descend into the sword world after you ascended." Those words were indeed from the bottom of his heart. Although he had been cultivating in the heavenly world previously, he had read some records of the upper world. Most of the environments of the upper world were cruel and bloody. The strong were respected and it was mostly survival of the fittest. Even the 9-firmament immortal domain of the heavenly world was the same. However, the sword world was clearly different. There were fewer schemes and plots in the sword world. They would not look down on somebody just because they came from the lower worlds. In the sword world, fairness was extremely important. Those sword cultivators could not even last a single round against him. In fact, many of them did not even have the chance to draw their swords. Although there was such a huge difference in combat strength between the two sides, the sword world had never thought of letting a perfected immortal of a higher cultivation realm come forward to suppress him. They did not let a couple of people attack him at the same time either. People of the sword world had to be fair in everything. Even for an outsider like him, as long as there was no deep hatred, these sword cultivators were unwilling to bully the weak with numbers. This was a spirit that the people of the sword world were willing to persevere and believe in. In the eyes of most people, that spirit might seem a little pedantic and naive. However, in Su Zimo's opinion, this was a civilization that was even more praiseworthy. Therefore, even though people from the sword world came to challenge him over the past 2 days, he did not go out and merely stopped once they were subdued. Right. Suddenly, Su Zimo recalled something. "I've observed some of the sword Taos of the sword cultivators of Carnage Sword Peak. They contain intense killing intent and should originate from the 3 great sword arts. What's the relationship between Carnage Sword Peak and the sword cultivator who created the 3 great sword arts back then?" Beiming Shui nodded. "That's a senior of the sword world. His name is Emperor Immortal Vanquishing. This Carnage Sword Peak was established because of him. The territory of the sword world was far inferior to the heavenly world as a whole. The mainland of Carnage Sword Peak was not even as vast as the divine firmament immortal domain. However, the strength and foundation of Carnage Sword Peak were not to be underestimated. Carnage Sword Peak focused in the Carnage Sword Tao." Su Zimo asked, "How's your cultivation of the heaven and earth slaying sword arts?" Back in Tianhuang mainland, Su Zimo had already imparted the 2 great sword arts to Beiming Shui. Beiming Shui released the 2 great sword arts in front of Su Zimo. Sensing the sword intent and killing intent contained within, Su Zimo nodded slightly. Beiming Shui's talent in the sword Tao was indeed shocking. All these years, even without his guidance, she had already cultivated the 2 great sword arts to greater mastery. It was also because Beiming Shui possessed 2 great sword arts that she came to Carnage Sword Peak after ascending to the sword world. In Carnage Sword Peak, she even had a chance to cultivate the human slaying sword art. However, she was unable to fuse the 3 great sword arts into one and comprehend the peerless divine power, Immortal Vanquishing Sword. Due to the death of Emperor Immortal Vanquishing, the ancient scrolls that recorded the 3 great sword arts were lost. Although the dharmic formulations of the 3 great sword arts were passed down, The sword intent of Emperor Immortal vanquishing could not be passed down. As for that sword intent, it was sealed in 3 ancient scrolls, which were the 3 sword arts in Su Zimo's hand. Only by witnessing and sensing the sword intent of the ancient scrolls with one's own eyes could they possibly fuse the 3 great sword art. Su Zimo took out the ancient scrolls of the 3 great sword arts and handed it to Beiming Shui. From today onwards, not only do you have to go to the waterfall of the sword cleansing pool to temper your body and bloodline, you have to continue cultivating the 3 great sword arts and comprehend the sword intent within. Beiming Shui's eyes lit up when she saw the 3 ancient scrolls. As a sword cultivator of the sword world, she naturally knew how valuable the 3 ancient scrolls were to her. "Thank you, Master." Beiming Shui received the 3 sword arts respectfully and began to cultivate in her cave abode. Although it was Su Zimo who imparted the Tao to Beiming Shui, in reality, he was comprehending the 3 great sword arts through Beiming Shui's Carnage Sword Tao at the same time. Right now, he had already synthesized the 3 great sword arts and could create the embryonic form of an immortal vanquishing sword. However, he had yet to truly comprehend that peerless divine power. In the past few days at Carnage Sword Peak, Su Zimo had gained a lot while absorbing and refining the killing intent emitted by Carnage Sword Peak and comprehending the 3 sword arts. There was a high chance that he would completely synthesize the 3 sword arts and comprehend the immortal vanquishing sword at Carnage Sword Peak. A few days later, in the meeting hall of Carnage Sword Peak. Apart from Wang Dong, Gong Suanyu, Sword Immortal Tai Lai, Shen Yu, Qin Zhong and Monk Ju Jian, there were 2 more Peak Paradise Void perfected immortals. One of them was dressed in black robes and exuded a cold aura. His face was thin and his eyes were sunken. This person's name was Li Shui and he came from Fiend Sword Peak. The other had a cold and expressionless expression. His pitch-black eyes seemed to be incapable of viewing anything other than the sword in his hands. This was Yi Wuchen of Sever Sword Peak. The number 1 of Sever Sword Peak, who was also the number 1 beauty of the sword world, was Lin Xuanzhen. Yi Wuchen's sword was second only to Lin Xuanzhen in Sever Sword Peak. It was the same for most sword cultivators of Sever Sword Peak. They severed their emotions and desires and treated everyone coldly, as though they did not care about anyone. The Sword Tao of Sever Sword Peak and Fiend Sword Peak were both unorthodox and were definitely not inferior to the Carnage Sword Tao in terms of killing. For example, sword cultivators of Fiend Sword Peak would lose their rationality if they were possessed in their Sword Tao. Coupled with the treacherous and ferocious nature of the Fiend technique, it was difficult for them to hold back. The sword cultivators of Sever Sword Peak were even more terrifying. They cultivated the Sever Sword Tao and could enter a special state at any moment to sever their 7 emotions and 6 desires. The only thing remaining would be the sword in their hands and the blood of their opponent. Once sword cultivators of those 2 sword peaks attacked, it would be difficult for them to control themselves. Wang Dong was a little exasperated. To think that even your 2 sword peaks would be alarmed by this matter. Li Shui said indifferently, "If not for the fact that the sword cultivators of your sword peaks are incapable, we wouldn't have appeared. We can't let an outsider trample on the reputation of the sword world." Wang Dong wanted to say something but hesitated. He sighed and stood up worriedly, pacing back and forth in the hall. After he walked a few rounds, Yi Wuchen seemed to be annoyed. Suddenly, he spoke with a cold voice. "Can you stop? He's just an outsider. Is there a need for you to worry so much?" Wang Dong turned to look at Yi Wuchen and asked, "Do you think I'm worried about fellow Daoist Su? Then what are you worried about?" Yi Wuchen asked. Wang Dong said, "The cultivators of Sever Sword Peak and Fiend Sword Peak often don't know their limits. I'm worried that that person might unleash an even more domineering counterattack and injure the junior brothers of your Sword Peak." Chapter 2746, Chapter 2746 Junior Brother Yun. Chapter 2746 Junior Brother Yun. When Li Shui heard that, he sneered, "Do you think he can injure the sword cultivators of Fiend Sword Peak? Once they become a fiend, their combat strength will increase by another level. In fact, they can even fight against celestial being perfected immortals. You worry too much." Yi Wuchen said indifferently without even looking at Wang Dong and could not be bothered to explain. The Sever-Sword Peak was the leader of the 8 sword peaks in this generation, so Yi Wuchen naturally had the confidence. Right then, a few figures sped over from outside, panting with shock in their eyes. When Wang Dong saw the expressions of the sword cultivators, he could already guess the outcome and shook his head gently. It's over. Li Shui frowned slightly and looked at the few sword cultivators of Carnage Sword Peak who had entered the hall. Why didn't junior brother Fu Ying come with you guys? Fu Ying was the sword cultivator chosen by Fiend Sword Peak to challenge Su Zimo. A sword cultivator coughed gently. Senior brother Fu Ying, lost. What? Suddenly, Li Shui stood up and shouted, impossible. Brother Li, don't be agitated. Calm down. Gong Suanyu persuaded hurriedly, let's clarify things first. Fiend Qi coiled around Li Shui's body and he was a little frustrated. After a while, he gradually calmed down and glared at the sword cultivator. How did Fu Ying lose? How many rounds did the two of them fight in that intense battle? Tell me properly and don't miss any details. The sword cultivator hesitated for a moment and stammered, it can't be considered an intense battle. Senior brother Fu Ying was restrained by the other party in a single round. He lost in a single round? Li Shui clenched his fists and his gaze was bloodshot. Sword Qi burst forth from his body and he became even more manic. Calm down, calm down. Wang Dong hurried forward and pressed Li Shui down, comforting him. It was the same for the junior brothers of the other sword peaks as well. Everyone merely lasted a single round or two. Gradually, Li Shui composed himself and retracted the sword Qi on his body. The sword cultivator glanced at Li Shui carefully and continued, after that, senior brother Fu Ying was so angry that he transformed into a fiend and ambushed the other party from behind. Fuck. When he heard that, Li Shui could no longer hold it in and scolded, that dog Fu Ying even dared to launch a sneak attack. His completely disgraced Fiend Sword Peak. When Wang Dong, Gong Suanyu and Qin Zhong heard that, they pouted as well. The other party had already let him off. To launch a sneak attack because he was indignant was the most despicable act in the sword world. Wang Dong coughed gently and explained for Fu Ying, perhaps junior brother Fu Ying has lost his mind after turning into a fiend. It shouldn't be in his nature to ambush others. Li Shui couldn't care less about that. As he cursed, he charged out of the hall and grit his teeth. I'm going to teach that lad a lesson right now. Fuck, I'll make him remember this. I don't think there's a need. The sword cultivator coughed gently. Senior brother Fu Ying has already been taught a lesson by fellow Daoist Su. Li Shui was stunned and asked instinctively, is that Su fellow alright? In Li Shui's subconscious mind, if Fu Ying transformed into a fiend and launched a sneak attack from behind, that cultivator Su would definitely lose. Wang Dong comforted, Brother Li, don't be so anxious. Let junior brother Wang finish speaking first. Junior brother Wang continued, at that time, when senior brother Fu Ying transformed into a fiend and suddenly attacked from behind, many sword cultivators present could not react in time. The two of them were extremely close to one another and there was no way to dodge. To think that fellow Daoist Su seemed to have eyes on his back. He did not even turn back and merely flicked his finger, colliding with senior brother Fu Ying's sword. Senior brother Fu Ying's destiny Immortal sword shattered on the spot. Suddenly, the meeting hall fell silent. Although Wang Dong and the others had long predicted Su Zimo's strength, they were still shocked by this scene. The destiny spirit treasure of a sword cultivator was destroyed by a single finger flick. Even after Fu Ying transformed into a fiend, he could not last a single round. What level of power was that? What kind of physique was that? That single detail proved that this person's precise control of the situation, judgment and reaction had already reached an extremely high level. Breaking Fu Ying's destiny spirit treasure could be considered an appropriate punishment for him. Even in Fiend Sword Peak, the matter of a sneak attack would not merely result in the destruction of a destiny spirit treasure. Suddenly, Qin Zhong asked, what grade is Fu Ying's destiny spirit treasure? It's a 7 tribulations spirit treasure. Li Shui said slowly. The corners of Wang Dong, Gong Suanyu and the others' eyes twitched uncontrollably and the hall fell silent once more. A moment later, a snort sounded in the hall. Yi Wuchen said indifferently, losing so badly despite an ambush in the fiend form. Fiend sword peak sure is capable. At the mention of that, Li Shue's face flushed red and he exploded instantly. Black sword chi coiled around his body as he gritted his teeth and glared at Yi Wuchen fiercely. However, Fiend Sword Peak was the one who embarrassed themselves first after all. He could not say anything because they were in the wrong. Li Shui could only sneer. Yi Wuchen, there's no need for you to be sarcastic. Your Sever Sword Peak won't be able to gain anything from this person either. Yi Wuchen said expressionlessly, no matter how useless my Sever Sword Peak's Ding Liu is, as long as he's in the emotions sever state, it's impossible for him to not last a single round. Right then, junior brother Wang said weakly, senior brother Ding of Sever Sword Peak did not last a single round either. Yi Wuchen's expression changed. Ever since he entered the hall, he had been expressionless, as though he was a person without any emotions. When he heard that, Yi Wuchen could not control his emotions. Ha 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 ha. Li Shui could not help but burst into laughter. The embarrassment and frustration from earlier on eased a lot. Yi Wuchen stood up and asked in a deep voice, Ding Liu did not manage to enter the emotions sever state? He did. Junior brother Wang nodded. However, after a single holler from fellow Daoist Su, senior brother Ding was dispelled from the state and was restrained by fellow Daoist Su. A single holler could dispel the emotions sever state. Li Shui retracted his smile and asked, this person came from the heavenly world. What divine powers and dharmic arts did he reveal? Which immortal, Buddhist, or fiend Tao did he cultivate? I don't know. Junior brother Wang shook his head. From the moment fellow Daoist Su attacked until now, he hasn't used any divine powers, secret skills, or even weapons. The peak-perfected immortals of the Eight Sword Peaks were no longer as relaxed as before and had grim expressions. It was not good for them to let an outsider overturn the paragons of the Eight Sword Peaks. After a moment of silence, Wang Dong looked at Sword Immortal Tai Lai and said in a deep voice, Brother Tai Lai, looks like we can only invite junior brother Yun of your Extreme Sword Peak out. Sword Immortal Tai Lai was helpless and smiled bitterly. Junior brother Yun is highly valued by Master in Extreme Sword Peak. He's currently in seclusion to comprehend the immortal vanquishing sword. Unless necessary, Master won't allow us to disturb him at all. Qin Zhong stood up and shouted, this matter concerns the reputation of the sword world. Are you telling me that even if the 8 of us head to Extreme Sword Peak together, we won't be able to get junior brother Yun out? I wish nothing more than to be able to attack personally. However, that Su Fellow's cultivation realm is too low. It'll be unfair if I were to attack. Sword Immortal Tai Lai pondered for a moment before nodding and saying, all right, we'll let junior brother Yun step in. Everyone, please follow me to Extreme Sword Peak. Chapter 2747, Chapter 2747 Famous. Chapter 2747 Famous. Extreme Sword Peak. A young man was in seclusion in his cave abode. A sharp sword surrounded by lightning floated on his left. The sword light was resplendent and sharp. On his right was a pitch-black and heavy sword that did not reveal any sharpness. In fact, the sword did not even have a sharp edge. The young man closed his eyes and circulated his bloodline. Sword chi vibrated and the sword hum intensified. However, his aura became even more restrained and not a single wisp of sword chi leaked out from his pores. He was like a heavy sword without an edge. Suddenly, the young man seemed to have sensed something and opened his eyes. A sharp glint flashed through his eyes before he regained clarity. Senior brothers, what's the matter? The young man was surprised and his spirit consciousness detected that 8 sword cultivators had arrived outside his cave abode. According to his understanding, the 8 of them were among the top perfected immortal experts of the 8 sword peaks. However, the young man still did not stand up and merely asked through the cave abode. After a moment of silence outside the cave abode, Sword Immortal Tai Lai sent a voice transmission. Junior brother Yun, something has indeed happened at Carnage Sword Peak. We hope you can settle it. What is it? The young man did not seem interested and asked casually. Sword Immortal Tai Lai said, Junior brother, you should have heard of junior sister Beiming Shui, right? Her master has arrived in our sword world. Some junior brothers of the 8 sword peaks went to spar with him but returned in massive defeat.
Oh.
The young man raised his brow slightly and his tone changed, as though he was interested. He knew that the battles in the sword world had always been fair. In other words, Beiming Shue's master was a convergence perfected immortal like him. He can actually defeat all the convergence perfected immortals of the 8 sword peaks. Interesting. The young man murmured softly. He had always loved to fight. However, in the sword world, no sword cultivator of the same cultivation realm was his match, causing him to be extremely vexed. Even if he wanted to challenge someone of a higher cultivation realm, the sword world would not allow it. He had heard that there was a sword Dao genius called Beiming Shui on Carnage Sword Peak who was also invincible among her peers. Unfortunately, there was no hope of her ever entering the perfected one realm. The two of them had no chance to fight at all. He only wanted to cultivate to the Paradise Void realm as soon as possible and fight against Lin Xuanzhen of Sever Sword Peak. When Wang Dong and the others saw that there was no sound in the cave abode, they thought that the young man was not interested. Suddenly, Sword Immortal Tai Lai said, "I heard that he's also from the heavenly world. Perhaps you might know him, junior brother Yun." Right then, the door to the cave abode opened. The young man walked out with 2 swords on his back and a playful smile. "I'll go over and take a look to see who from the heavenly world is here." Everyone heaved a sigh of relief when they saw that the young man was willing to step in. Sword Immortal Tai Lai smiled. "You're both from the heavenly world. Perhaps you might know him, junior brother Yun." "I might not recognize him." The young man shook his head gently and changed the topic proudly. "However, if he's from the heavenly world, he'll definitely have heard of my name. Haha." Qin Zhong burst into laughter. "That's good. At that time, perhaps we might be able to have him back off without fighting just by revealing your name, junior brother Yun." Wang Dong nodded as well and smiled. "That way, our sword world can salvage some reputation." The young man said indifferently, "I hope that this person has the guts to fight me so that I can show what I've learned and fight to my heart's content." This time round, Wang Dong and the others were prepared to go with the young man. Apart from Wang Dong, no one else had seen Beiming Shue's master before. This was a good opportunity for them to witness this person's methods. "Have you heard? Senior brother Wang and the others went to Extreme Sword Peak and invited that monster incarnate of Extreme Sword Peak out to deal with that Su fellow. That's great. He's bound to lose if senior brother Yun steps in. We can't be too sure." Those senior brothers previously were all arrogant, but in the end, they returned after suffering crushing defeats and lost all dignity. Junior brother Yun is different from them. The moment junior brother Yun entered the perfected one realm, he fought against those senior brothers and defeated them almost effortlessly. With a few days of spreading, the matter of Carnage Sword Peak caused a huge commotion among the 8 sword peaks. Almost everyone was paying attention and discussing it. This matter was pushed to its climax the moment that monster incarnate of Extreme Sword Peak came out of seclusion. The sword cultivators of the 8 sword peaks, be it ordinary disciples or legacy disciples, moved when they heard the news and headed to Carnage Sword Peak to watch the battle and join in the fun. Instantly, Carnage Sword Peak became the center of the entire sword world. More and more sword cultivators gathered outside Beiming Shue's cave abode. At a single glance, the entire world was densely packed. With everyone crowding around, the young man arrived in front of the cave abode. A few sword cultivators could not hold it in any longer and knocked on the door. Before long, the door to the cave abode opened. Beiming Shui walked out and frowned. "Are you guys done with your daily challenges?" The young man had only heard of Beiming Shue's name before. This was the first time he was seeing her and he was stunned. Wang Dong had an apologetic expression as he went forward and promised, "Junior sister Beiming, this matter has indeed gone a little overboard. Regardless of victory or defeat, today shall be the last battle." Beiming Shui said, "After I become a perfected immortal, if any of you want to fight, I will accede." Qin Zhong walked up proudly and said with a smile, "Junior sister Beiming, ask your master to come out. This junior brother Yun is also from the heavenly world. Who knows, the two of them might know each other." The young man looked at Beiming Shui and cupped his fist slightly, saying proudly, "Junior sister Beiming, I'm Yunting. Go and ask him if he's heard of my name. Ah, it's fellow Daoist Yunting. You're indeed famous." Right then, a voice sounded from the cave abode. When he heard that voice, Yunting shuddered and his expression changed starkly. Was he hearing things? What the hell? Right then, a green-robed cultivator strode out and looked at Yunting, who was not far away, with a relaxed expression and a fake smile. In reality, Su Zimo did not expect to see Yunting in the sword world either. Back at the divine firmament meet, after Yunting was defeated, he handed the human-slaying sword art to him and left the heavenly world, his whereabouts unknown. To think that Yunting would come to the sword world. Furthermore, he had already condensed a Dao fruit in a short period of time and stepped into the perfected One realm, becoming a perfected Immortal. He did not know what Yunting had experienced from the heavenly world to the sword world. However, it could be seen that he had benefited immensely and had indeed undergone a transformation. Su Zimo sized Yunting up. In the past, Yunting possessed an unsheathed sharpness, like the divine firmament sword behind him. Right now, although he was still sharp, Yunting could restrain that sharpness. It was like the other sword on his back. The heavy sword had no edge and was perfectly made. At that moment, Yunting already had the concept of returning to simplicity in the sword Dao. He was clearly stronger than when the two of them fought back then. Wang Dong and the others did not notice anything amiss. They thought that Yunting's name was so incredible that even Su Zimo was stunned. Qin Zhong grinned and shouted, "Su, since you've heard of junior brother Yun, do you dare to fight him?" Chapter 2748, Chapter 2748 He's my brother-in-law. Chapter 2748 He's my brother-in-law. When Yunting saw Su Zimo, his expression changed continuously. First, he was shocked and in disbelief. Then, he was pleasantly surprised and almost shouted. However, on second thought, he quickly calmed down. Su Zimo possessed the bloodline of the creation Green Lotus, and this matter caused him to be hunted for his life in the heavenly world. Right now, everyone thought that Su Zimo was dead. If he revealed Su Zimo's identity, who knew what changes would happen? In his heart, he naturally did not want to lose a powerful rival like Su Zimo. Su Zimo's existence was precisely the reason why he was constantly motivated to advance bravely in the sword Dao with indomitable will. Furthermore, he was certain that his sister would not want anything to happen to Su Zimo. Right then, Yunting heard Qin Zhong asking Su Zimo loudly if he dared to fight him. Su Zimo smiled gently and looked at Yunting, who was not far away. He nodded slightly. "Actually, fellow Daoist Yunting and I." "Oh no." Before Su Zimo could finish, Yunting interrupted hurriedly. Yunting could tell that Su Zimo wanted to say that they had fought before. If he said that, others would definitely be curious about the outcome of the battle between the two of them. There was no way he could hide the fact that he had lost twice in a row. After Yunting arrived at the sword world, he displayed his talent in the sword Dao to the fullest and was valued by countless seniors of the sword world. He could be said to be the center of attention. He could not afford the embarrassment if Su Zimo were to reveal in public that he had been defeated twice. Yunting's shout not only confused Su Zimo but everyone else as well. Yunting jogged over to Su Zimo and shouted, "What a kooky coincidence. The two of us are deeply related." Initially, Su Zimo was going to talk about fighting. Who knew that Yunting would suddenly change the topic? Yunting looked at Wang Dong, Sword Immortal Tai Lai and the others. He wrapped his arm around Su Zimo's shoulder and smiled. "This is my brother-in-law." "Huh?" Wang Dong, Sword Immortal Tai Lai and the others were dumbfounded and their jaws almost dropped to the ground. The surrounding sword cultivators who were watching and waiting to witness an unprecedented battle were stunned on the spot as well. Beiming Shui frowned slightly. Suddenly, she turned around and glanced at Su Zimo before glaring at Yunting with an inexplicable hostility. Su Zimo frowned slightly, not knowing why Yunting had suddenly gone crazy. Just as he was about to speak, Yunting winked at him. "Brother Su, I've heard about everything from my sister." Yunting sent a voice transmission with his spirit consciousness. "You have the creation Green Lotus bloodline. It's best if you don't expose your identity. Su Zimo naturally knew about that and had no intention of revealing his identity in the first place. However, he did not know what his intention of hiding his identity had to do with Yun Ting coming over to claim that he was his brother-in-law. Fellow Daoist Su is your brother-in-law? Sword Immortal Tai Lai was still in disbelief. Wasn't this way too coincidental? Yun Ting said, of course. His name is Su Zhu and he's in love with my sister. The two of us are very close as well. The corners of Su Zimo's mouth twitched at the mention of Su Zhu. Wasn't that name way too casual? It was obvious that it was merely a combination of his surname and Yun Zhu's name. Su Zimo did not say anything. In any case, he had never mentioned his name to anyone in the sword world. He would just let it be Su Zhu then. As for what Yun Ting said about him being in love with Yun Zhu, he merely took it that Yun Ting was just saying it casually and did not take it to heart. However, Bei Ming Shui narrowed her eyes slightly and looked at Yun Ting with a somewhat terrifying gaze. Wang Dong, Sword Immortal Tai Lai and the others exchanged glances with awkward expressions. Who would have thought that after inviting Yun Ting out, there would be a family recognition scene instead of a shocking battle? Then, Sword Immortal Tai Lai probed, Junior Brother Yun, are you still going to fight fellow Daoist Su? In the hearts of Wang Dong and the others, they still hoped that Yun Ting could defeat Su Zimo and save some face for the sword world. Yun Ting waved his hand and said self-righteously, this is my brother-in-law. We're family. Why should we fight? Do you fight with your brother-in-laws for no reason as well? Yun Ting's words made Sword Immortal Tai Lai choke. At that point, Su Zimo finally understood why Yun Ting would come over to acknowledge him as his brother-in-law. He was just saving himself some face. Sigh. The surrounding sword cultivators sighed with disappointed expressions. They had teleported over from the various sword peaks in anticipation of an unprecedented battle. To think that the two of them were relatives. The expectation of a huge battle came to nothing as well. Let's disperse, sigh. Seems like there's really no one among the convergence perfected immortals of the 8 sword peaks who can restrain Su Zhu. That Su Zhu is really lucky to be able to become relatives with junior brother Yun and become a family. The sword cultivators of the 8 sword peaks discussed and dispersed. Wang Dong, Sword Immortal Tai Lai and the others were still standing on the spot. Their minds were in a mess and they felt indignant. Senior brothers, if there's nothing else, I'll return to the cave abode with brother-in-law. Yun Ting cupped his fists slightly. We haven't seen each other for a long time and I'd like to have a good chat with him. Junior brother Yun, please go ahead. Wang Dong and the others replied politely. Brother-in-law, let's go. Yun Ting hugged Su Zimo and walked towards Bei Ming Shui's cave abode. For some unknown reason, ever since Yun Ting acknowledged Su Zimo as his brother-in-law, he felt a chill run down his spine. Yun Ting turned back and looked into Bei Ming Shui's cold eyes. He shuddered unconsciously. Arriving at the cave abode, the moment the three of them sat down, Yun Ting could not help but laugh. Brother Su, this is great. To think that you're not dead. Back then, when I saw the message sent by my sister, I was sad for you for a long time. The sect master of the academy is fucking inhumane. Su Zimo could sense that Yun Ting was truly happy for him. Although the two of them had fought twice, there was no feud between them. Instead, they respected each other. Furthermore, Su Zimo had a good relationship with Yun Zhu. Right then, Bei Ming Shui suddenly asked, Master, what's with the brother-in-law he mentioned? No, don't listen to his nonsense. Su Zimo smiled. He just didn't want to spar with me and found an excuse for himself. Oh. Bei Ming Shui nodded, as though she had a load off her mind. Yun Ting was unhappy when he heard that. He said hurriedly, Hey, don't misunderstand. It's true that I called you brother-in-law because I didn't want to spar with you, but I'm not afraid of you. I'm sure you can tell that I've gained a lot in the sword world over the years. I was just thinking of finding someone to sharpen my sword Dao. You're the best candidate. However, I learned from my sister that you have the creation Green Lotus bloodline. If we had fought earlier on and you were wary and could not release your blood chi, you would not have been able to unleash your full strength. Even if I defeated you, it would have been an unfair victory. Chapter 2749, Chapter 2749 Infatuation. Chapter 2749 Infatuation. As he said that, Yunting glanced at Beiming Shui from the corner of his eye, as though he wanted to prove that he was not afraid of Su Zimo at all. However, Beiming Shui lowered her gaze and ignored him. Yunting coughed gently and puffed out his chest, saying proudly, "Brother Su, if you don't believe me, we'll head to a secret place to fight another day. You can do whatever you want and we'll fight to our heart's content without holding back." Another day? Su Zimo smiled without saying anything. He believed that given Yunting's pride, he would not be afraid of him just because he had lost to him twice. But now, the difference between the two of them was even greater than back at the divine firmament Immortal meet. Yunting had indeed improved in the sword Dao. However, his Dao fruit condensed the profoundness of high-grade cultivation techniques of immortals, Buddhas, fiends, and demons. It even contained dharmic Daos of a few taboo mystic classics, and he attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation before advancing to the perfected one realm. Even without using blood chi, the body of a grade 12 creation green lotus could take on a 9 tribulations pure yang spirit treasure head-on. To be precise, his green lotus true body was a 9 tribulations pure yang spirit treasure in itself. Furthermore, he was now in mastery of a few quasi-peerless divine powers. Right now, Su Zimo might only need to use 50% of his strength to suppress Yunting. After he met with the calamity this time round, he made a trip to the Death's Door and Yellow Springs Road of the Netherworld and revived in the Emperor's tomb. His gains were way too great. Until now, he had yet to fully digest and absorb everything. Currently, he had already removed the 2 curses in his body and was refining the energy that he had absorbed from the Emperor's tomb. The energy was significant enough. Once he refined it all, he would be able to break through and advance another level to reach the celestial being perfected one realm. The gap between him and Yunting would only increase. Back then, Su Zimo even regarded Yunting as his greatest opponent. But now, his ambitions were much greater. He was aiming for the 10,000 races and trichiliocosm, looking down on both past and present. What's wrong? When Yunting saw that Su Zimo was only smiling without saying anything, he could not help but raise his brows and ask provocatively, "Are you afraid?" Su Zimo smiled gently. "If you want to find an opponent to sharpen your sword Dao, there's indeed a suitable person who is beside me right now." "Who?" Yunting asked. Su Zimo looked at Beiming Shui who was not far away. "Huh!" Yunting could not believe it. Beiming Shui's talent in the sword Dao was indeed not bad. However, she cultivated that martial Dao and was trapped in the heaven essence realm. She could not even condense a Dao fruit and was of no threat to him at all. There was a huge gap between the two of them. Su Zimo said, "Beiming is my eldest disciple. Of course, I'm not talking about now. When she becomes a perfected immortal, you guys can spar." "That's ridiculous." Yunting rolled his eyes. "Among those of the same cultivation realm, apart from you, who else can be my match? Furthermore, Su Zimo, you're looking down on me way too much. Although I view you as my greatest opponent, you're trying to send me away with a mere disciple of yours." I. Before Yunting could finish, he suddenly felt a chill. Not far away, Beiming Shui was looking at him with a calm expression and a cold gaze. I. Yunting hesitated for a moment and smiled awkwardly. "Junior sister Beiming, it's naturally not that I look down on you. However, our cultivation realms are different now and we can't spar. If you have any questions about the sword Dao later on, you can look for me. Su Zimo definitely can't compare to me in terms of the sword Dao." Beiming Shui clenched her fists slowly and remained silent. She merely looked at Yunting deeply before getting up and walking out. "Junior sister Beiming, where are you going?" Yunting asked instinctively. Beiming Shui had an indifferent expression and left the cave abode without even looking at Yunting. Yunting turned back to look at Su Zimo and asked, "Did junior sister Beiming get angry?" "I didn't even say anything." Su Zimo smiled. "She's always been like this. It might not be targeted at you. In that case, where is she going?" Yunting asked again. Su Zimo said in a deep voice, "Probably to cultivate." Actually, He could vaguely guess some of Beiming Xue's thoughts. Beiming Xue probably wanted to cultivate faster and strive to advance to the true martial realm as soon as possible to condense the true martial Dao body to fight Yunting. For some unknown reason, Su Zimo could vaguely sense that Beiming Xue seemed to be extremely hostile towards Yunting. This should be the first time the two of them met. Although Yunting was a little talkative, he should not have offended Beiming Xue in any way. Perhaps I'm imagining things. Su Zimo shook his head. Right then, Yunting suddenly leaned over and rubbed his palms with a hesitant expression. Brother Su, does your eldest disciple have a Dao companion? No. Su Zimo looked at the infatuated and sheepish Yunting with a fake smile. It was clear that he had seen through Yunting's thoughts. Sensing Su Zimo's gaze, Yunting knew that he could not hide it and no longer beat the bush. Brother Su, I've long seen through things between you and my sister. Don't worry, I'll definitely support you guys with all my might. I've been obsessed with the sword Dao all these years and have never had a Dao companion. Your eldest disciple is single as well. Why don't you help matchmake us? At that point, Yunting seemed to have suddenly thought of something and added hurriedly, however, there's one thing. The seniority between the two of us can't change even after I become Dao companions with her. What are you thinking? There's nothing between me and Yunzhu. Su Zimo was exasperated. As for what you said, it depends on Beiming's feelings. I won't interfere with her. That's nothing. Yunting said, you're her master. It's easy for you to arrange a marriage for her. When Su Zimo heard that, he said sternly, no matter who it is, be it her master or parents, no one can decide her fate and life. Beiming isn't a 3-year-old child. She has her own choice. In the ideology of Yunting and most of the others, they were still bound to the familial ties of letting parents make decisions for them. However, Su Zimo's growth experience was different from others. He was unwilling to impose his will on others. When Yunting saw how serious Su Zimo was, he changed his words and asked, in that case, you won't stop me from courting her? Su Zimo nodded. Yunting beamed. That's simple. If junior sister Beiming enters the perfected one realm, she can come spar with me. Yunting suddenly changed his mind and agreed. In his opinion, when the two of them fought, he would subdue Beiming Xue with the supreme sword Dao and reveal his peerless bearing. How could she not fall for him at that time? It did not matter even if Beiming Xue refused to admit defeat for the first time. If she was indignant, she would look for him to fight a second or third time. As time passed, the two of them would interact with one another for longer and longer. How could he not stand a chance by then? If Beiming Xue was still uninterested in him at that time, he would release his ultimate move and challenge Su Zimo. As long as he defeated Su Zimo, it would be enough to shock Beiming Xue immensely. Chapter 2750 Chapter 2750 Testing the Sword with You. Chapter 2750 Testing the Sword with You. Yunting smiled foolishly as he fantasized. However, he snapped back to his senses before long and sighed with a vexed expression. However, when can junior sister Beiming ever become a perfected immortal with that martial Dao that she's cultivating? What if I'm already an immortal king by the time junior sister Beiming advances to the perfected one realm? How can we compete at that time? At that thought, Yunting looked at Su Zimo resentfully. And you? You cultivated the immortal and Buddhist Daos yourself but let your eldest disciple cultivate that bullshit martial Dao. Su Zimo said indifferently, go back and prepare well. You won't be able to wait long for this battle. He had been paying attention to Beiming Xue's cultivation the entire time. During this period of time, with his help, Beiming Xue's physique and bloodline were reborn and her fate ring realm was infinitely close to perfected. Beiming Xue had a breakthrough in the cultivation of the 3 great sword arts as well. Right now, all she lacked was an opportunity to advance to the true martial realm. I hope so. Yunting sighed softly, still in disbelief. When Su Zimo saw that, he said meaningfully, Brother Yun, there's something I have to remind you of. My intention in arranging for Beiming to spar with you was not to matchmake the two of you or find an opponent for you. Then what was it for? Yunting asked. Su Zimo said slowly, when Beiming becomes a perfected immortal, She needs to find someone to test her sword and prove herself in the sword world. You're the most suitable person for that. In reality, even Su Zimo did not know how much Beiming Shui's sword Dao cultivation would increase after she entered the true martial realm. The best way was to find a suitable person for her to test her sword with. Yun Ting was that person. You want to use me to test her sword? The moment Yun Ting heard that, he exploded and sneered, "You and your disciple look down on others too much. You've indeed defeated me twice, but you expect your disciple to do the same and even test her sword on me. From a certain perspective, Beiming is not my disciple." Su Zimo said, "She's the #1 successor of the martial Dao and you're only her first obstacle in the martial Dao and the sword Dao." "All right." Yun Ting sneered, "I'd like to see how much of a surprise junior sister Beiming can give me." "It won't be a surprise." Su Zimo shook his head gently. "When the time comes, just don't disappoint her." Yun Ting. Yun Ting was furious and gritted his teeth. Without saying a word, he turned around and left. If he continued talking to Su Zimo, he was worried that he would not be able to hold it in and would attack Su Zimo. The moment he left the cave abode, he saw Wang Dong and sword Immortal Tai Lai standing side by side not far away, talking about something. When they saw Yun Ting appear, the two of them welcomed him. "Junior brother Yun, did something happen?" Wang Dong was very observant and asked when he saw Yun Ting's expression. "They'll be fine." Yun Ting waved his hand and changed the topic. "Senior brothers, what are you doing here?" The two of them exchanged glances. Wang Dong said, "Junior brother Yun, since you have a deep relationship with fellow Daoist Su Zhu, we're wondering if you can persuade him to not continue torturing junior sister Beiming." Even the 8 peak masters praised junior sister Beiming's talent in the sword Dao. "We're worried that if she continues to cultivate like this, she'll be crippled." Crippled? When Yun Ting heard that, he was infuriated and mocked, "How can she be crippled? The martial Dao is so incredibly powerful. When junior sister Beiming becomes a perfected immortal, even I won't be her match." Wang Dong and sword Immortal Tai Lai were confused by Yun Ting's rebuttal. They did not know where Yun Ting's temper came from. Yun Ting said, "I'm not going to persuade him. I want to see how junior sister Beiming can attract the perfected one heavenly tribulation and become a perfected immortal if she can't condense a Dao fruit." "Well." Wang Dong and sword Immortal Tai Lai exchanged glances. Wasn't Yun Ting chummy with his brother-in-law earlier on? Did they have a fight? Pausing for a moment, Yun Ting continued, "In addition, senior brothers, it's better for you to restrain the sword cultivators of the various sword peaks. Don't bother having those of the same cultivation realm challenge him lest they embarrass themselves. Even if those of the same cultivation realm gather in a formation, they might not be able to win him, let alone fight one-on-one." Peak of Carnage Sword Peak. This was the center of Carnage Sword Continent and was also where the sword chi was the strongest. Without a grotto heaven cultivation, one could not stand on the peak of the mountain. At that moment, 8 cultivators were gathered at the peak of the mountain. They were either sitting or standing, sipping tea and chatting casually with relaxed expressions. Among the 8 of them, there were 7 men and a woman. They were the peak masters of the 8 sword peaks. The peak master of Sever Sword Peak, the only woman among the 8, looked at the figure who was swimming against the current and charging at the sword chi waterfall at the foot of Carnage Sword Peak and sighed gently with a pained expression. "Beiming Shui has suffered a lot over the past few days. Amitabha." The peak master of Zen Sword Peak chanted a Buddhist proclamation softly. However, her physique and bloodline are clearly undergoing a metamorphosis. Although she's still unable to condense a Dao fruit, her combat strength is even stronger than before. There shouldn't be any disadvantages for Beiming Shui. The peak master of Carnage Sword Peak harumphed coldly. "If that wasn't the case, I would have chased her master out of the sword world a long time ago. I wouldn't care even if I was criticized for it. Your temper's still the same as always." This chapter's initial release occurred on the N0v3 LB1N site. The others smiled. The peak master of Extreme Sword Peak said, "Speaking of which, her master is from the heavenly world like Yun Ting. To think that he has such a relationship with Yun Ting." The peak master of Illusory Sword Peak frowned. I heard that Yun Ting's sister is one of the 4 great fairies of the heavenly world. I've never heard of her having a Tao companion. I'm not sure about that. The others shook their heads slightly. The heavenly world. The Peak Master of Fiend Sword Peak pondered for a moment. I heard that a creation green lotus appeared in the heavenly world and condensed into a human body. It has already cultivated to grade 12. I've heard about that too. The Peak Master of 5 Elements Sword Peak had a regretful expression. Unfortunately, that cultivator with the green lotus body was forced into the Emperor's tomb and died. How precious is a grade 12 creation green lotus. Even Emperor Immortal Vanquishing did not manage to nurture it back then. Sigh. The Peak Master of Tyrant Sword Peak said, "It's a pity for that paragon. He can only blame fate for playing tricks on him. If he was born in our sword world, he wouldn't have ended up like this." That's right. The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak said, if he was born in the sword world, the experts of the 8 sword peaks would definitely protect him and allow him to grow smoothly, restoring the glory of Emperor Immortal Vanquishing back then. At the mention of Emperor Immortal Vanquishing, the few of them looked at the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak instinctively. After all, Carnage Sword Peak beneath them was established because of Emperor Immortal Vanquishing. At that moment, the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak looked at the withered lotus flowers growing on the peak with a conflicted expression and mixed emotions. On the mountain peak, the sword chi was violent and sharp. Even perfected immortals could not withstand it. However, the withered lotus flowers had been growing here the entire time and it was a strange scene. The Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak revealed a reminiscent expression and sighed heavily. These lotus flowers were personally planted by Emperor Immortal Vanquishing when he established Carnage Sword Peak back then. Unfortunately, after Emperor Immortal Vanquishing died and the creation green lotus shattered, the lotus flowers withered and never bloomed again. Chapter 2751, Chapter 2751 Breakthrough. Chapter 2751 Breakthrough. Ever since Yun Ting came out of seclusion and acknowledged a brother-in-law, this matter was left unsettled. Although Wang Dong and the others could not bear to see Beiming Shui suffer, they were helpless against Su Zimo, who was almost invincible at the Convergence realm. Everyone could only pray that Beiming Shui would back down and stop at the precipice. Beiming Shui was so talented in the sword Dao that no one wanted to see her waste her precious time cultivating the martial Dao. In the blink of an eye, 3 years passed. For the past 3 years, Su Zimo had been staying in Beiming Shui's cave abode and had not left. The Convergence perfected immortals of the 8 sword peaks knew that they were no match for him and no one came forward to challenge him. As such, he enjoyed peace. As he imparted the Dao to Beiming Shui, he maintained his cultivation. Finally, on this day, Su Zimo felt an opportunity to break through. In reality, the true essence in his body had already accumulated to its peak 2 years ago and he was only waiting for a suitable opportunity. Beiming Shui sensed something at the side and snapped out of her cultivation state. She hurriedly activated the Immortal formation in her cave abode. This Immortal formation was set up by Su Zimo a year ago to prevent the traces of the Green Lotus bloodline from being leaked when he broke through. Su Zimo raised his head slowly and looked into the skies. There was only the thick stone wall of the cave abode above his head and he could not see anything. However, Su Zimo's eyes seemed to be able to penetrate the layers of void and see the sky outside the cave abode and the firmaments of the sword world. A resplendent starry sky was vaguely reflected in those clear eyes. There was the galaxy hanging upside down, the flow of time and the change of time and space. At that moment, Su Zimo's spirit seemed to have broken through layers of obstacles with the help of the power of the Dao fruit and was connected to the entire universe, resonating with it. In Su Zimo's consciousness, a sparkling fruit spun slowly with a powerful aura. Furthermore, as time passed, the aura continued to rise rapidly. At that moment, it was as though everything had vanished. Even Su Zimo's body vanished. There was only a sparkling and resplendent Dao fruit left in the vast world. The only difference in the Dharmic formulations of the Immortal, Buddhist and Fiend Daos were their natures, Dao hearts and intents. However, the Dharmic Dao profundities were more or less the same. In the lower worlds, Immortals, Buddhas and Fiends all had golden cores. This was the first time they broke free from the shackles of the world, and their lifespans increased to 500 years. After that, there would be heaven and earth Dharma characteristics. Among the Dharmic Taos of immortals, Buddhas, and fiends, the most important core was to comprehend the heaven and earth and communicate with it, establishing a connection with it. The heaven and earth Dharma characteristic was condensed using the heaven and earth powers. In the lower worlds, cultivators could only comprehend the minor chiliocosms. After ascending to the upper world, cultivators could comprehend an even wider, more perfect, and endless medium chiliocosm. The so-called celestial being realm was for cultivators to resonate with the world through their Tao fruits. This chapter's initial release occurred on the N0V3LB1N site. The Tao fruit was the crystallization of the essence of the Dharmic Tao cultivated by cultivators. When that resonance was produced, it was equivalent to the recognition of this Tao fruit. The power of the Tao fruit would increase exponentially. At the same time, the immense power in the Tao fruit would feed back to the cultivator himself once more, allowing perfected immortals who had stepped into the celestial being realm to improve their bodies, bloodlines, and essence spirits greatly. The process of stepping into the celestial realm lasted for an entire day. Su Zimo's aura rose continuously as well. As immortal Queen Ling Long had expected, the grade 12 creation Green Lotus was not the end but only the starting point. The blood chi of the Green Lotus true body was still increasing and there was no upper limit. His essence spirit cultivation had always been far ahead of his cultivation realm. After entering the heaven immortal realm, the Green Lotus essence spirit had already reached the Paradise Void Perfected One realm, which was the same as a perfected immortal. The perfected one realm was divided into 4 minor realms. The reason why it was so clear and corresponded to different names was because there was a huge difference in strength between the 4 minor realms. Throughout history, it was extremely rare for paragons and monster incarnates to have essence spirits that were a minor realm above their cultivation realms. As for Su Zimo's Green Lotus essence spirit, it was 2 minor cultivation realms ahead of him. During the process of Su Zimo breaking through to the celestial being realm, he released a huge amount of true essence energy that filled Beiming Shue's cave abode. Furthermore, during the process of communicating with the world, the resonance was so strong that even the immortal formation set up in the cave abode could not withstand it and cracks appeared. A wisp of the true essence aura of the Green Lotus true body leaked through the cracks. Right then, Su Zimo opened his eyes and took a deep breath, absorbing the essence chi that filled Beiming's cave abode like a whale swallowing a cow. Beiming Shui guarded Su Zimo the entire time without taking a half step away. For an entire day, she was lucky enough to witness Su Zimo's entire breakthrough. It was way too rare to see and feel it at such a close distance. The mysterious process of comprehending the heaven and earth and communicating with it deeply touched her. Su Zimo's breakthrough this time round was also a huge opportunity for Beiming Shui, allowing her to feel the opportunity to advance to the true martial realm. As for the wisp of true essence that leaked out of Beiming Shue's cave abode, it floated and fused into Carnage Sword Peak. On the peak of Carnage Sword Peak, the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak was resting with his eyes closed. Suddenly, as though he sensed something, he opened his eyes and his gaze landed on a few withered lotus flowers not far away. The expression of the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak changed and his gaze froze. At that moment, a few of the withered lotus flowers actually had traces of green life. Although there were still no flower buds growing, a few tender green spots appeared on the stems of the green lotuses and new lotus leaves appeared. What happened? Suddenly, the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak stood up and stared at the few green lotus flowers in surprise and joy. Right then, he sensed something and turned around abruptly. He looked in the direction of Beiming Shue's cave abode and a resplendent sword beam burst forth from his eyes. The aura of the heavenly tribulation. Has Beiming Shui broken through? The heart of the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak skipped a beat with a look of disbelief. In their opinion, Beiming Shui had gone astray when she cultivated the martial Tao. Even if she cultivated that so-called level 9 fate ring and was strong among those of the same cultivation realm, she could never condense a Tao fruit and would never be able to advance to the perfected one realm. But now, the aura of the perfected one heavenly tribulation had already spread from Beiming Shue's side. She did it. After the shock, a look of ecstasy appeared in the eyes of the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak. No matter what, as long as Beiming Shui attracted the perfected one heavenly tribulation, she had a chance of becoming a perfected immortal. Furthermore, what made the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak even more excited was that he felt that he had found the reason for the revival of the lotus flowers. It had to be Beiming Shui. How could there be such a coincidence in the world? Beiming Shui had just broken through and was about to attract the perfected one heavenly tribulation when a few lotus flowers on the mountain peak revived. How impressive was it to have such a phenomenon accompany her when she broke through? According to the trend, after Beiming Shui's tribulation transcendence ended, the green lotuses on the mountain peak would probably awaken and bloom on Carnage Sword Peak once more. In fact, the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak suspected that Beiming Shui was the reincarnation of Emperor Immortal vanquishing. Heaven's will. This must be Heaven's will. The Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak muttered excitedly, "The heavens are blessing our sword world." Chapter 2752, Chapter 2752 Attention of everyone. Chapter 2752 Attention of everyone. 5 Elements Sword Peak. Suddenly, the Peak Master of 5 Elements Sword Peak reached out and plucked a ball of light from the void. The moment his spirit consciousness touched it, he received the information inside. Beiming Shui broke through and attracted the perfected one heavenly tribulation. The Peak Master of 5 Elements Sword Peak had a surprised expression. If not for the fact that the message came from the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak, he would not have believed it. The Peak Master of 5 Elements Sword Peak pondered for a moment and chose to announce the news. Cultivators who wanted to watch Beiming Shui undergo tribulation transcendence could head to Carnage Sword Peak. At the same time, the Peak Masters of the other 6 Sword Peaks received news from the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak. The martial Tao that Beiming Shui cultivates can also attract the perfected one heavenly tribulation. From what I know, the 9 fate rings that Beiming Shui cultivated seem to be unable to condense a Tao fruit, right? If she doesn't have a Tao fruit, how can she advance to the perfected one realm? From what I know, the 9 fate rings that Beiming Shui cultivated seem to be unable to condense a Tao fruit, right? If she doesn't have a Tao fruit, how can she advance to the perfected one realm? I'm not sure. However, since it's a message from Brother Lu, it shouldn't be wrong. Let's go take a look too. The other 7 Peak Masters of Sword Peak were doubtful and did not believe it. However, the 7 of them still chose to announce this matter. As for the other sword cultivators of the Sword Peaks, it was up to them if they wanted to head over and watch. Generally speaking, when sword cultivators of the sword world underwent the perfected one heavenly tribulation, other sword cultivators could watch from the side. However, if the heavenly tribulation was only at the 5th or 6th level, it would not be attractive to most sword cultivators. If he could reach the 7th level of the perfected one heavenly tribulation, it would attract many cultivators. For example, when Yunting underwent tribulation transcendence back then, the commotion was huge. Almost half of the perfected immortals of the 8 sword peaks came and many sword cultivators who were in seclusion came out at the last minute. Have you heard? Beiming Shui of Carnage Sword Peak is about to undergo tribulation transcendence. Really? Her cultivation path is completely different from ours. I wonder which heavenly tribulation she can attract. She's so talented in the sword Tao. The heavenly tribulation probably won't be too weak. Not necessarily. That martial Tao she's cultivating was created by a cultivator of the lower worlds. How can it be compared to the dharmic Taos of the immortal, Buddhist and fiend Taos that have been passed down through the ages? In my opinion, she might not even be able to attract the 5th level of the perfected one heavenly tribulation. After the news spread, it caused a huge discussion among the 8 sword peaks. Firstly, Beiming Shui was considered a celebrity among the 8 sword peaks and many sword cultivators admired her secretly. Secondly, Beiming Shui cultivated the martial Tao. Many sword cultivators were curious how many perfected one heavenly tribulations Beiming Shui could attract after cultivating the martial Tao. Many cultivators moved one after another and headed to Carnage Sword Peak to take a look through the teleportation formations of their respective sword peaks. Yun Ting broke out of seclusion right away as well. He looked in the direction of Carnage Sword Peak and harumphed when he recalled his deal with Su Zimo 3 years ago. Fortunately, I didn't have to wait long. I want to see how far your disciple can go. When junior sister Beiming's tribulation transcendence is over, I'll fight her and beat her until she's convinced. H, since you stole my sister, I'll steal your disciple as well and we'll be even. As he said that, Yun Ting set off for the teleportation formation of Extreme Sword Peak as well. At the same time, Gong Suanyu, Sword Immortal Tai Lai, Yi Wuchen, Shen Yu, Li Shui, Qin Zhong and Monk Ju Jian arrived at Carnage Sword Peak one after another. At that moment, the surrounding 500 kilometers of Beiming Shui's cave abode was classified as a forbidden ground. 10 Immortal King experts of Carnage Sword Peak left the mountain and guarded 10 spatial nodes in the surroundings, prohibiting anyone from entering to prevent any accidents from interfering with Beiming Shui's tribulation transcendence. Thousands of miles away, the world was already filled with people. The perfected one heavenly tribulation had long begun. How's everything? Qin Zhong was the last to arrive. He looked at Wang Dong and the others and asked, which heavenly tribulation is it? It's the 3rd level right now. Wang Dong replied in a deep voice. He looked at the figure in the tribulation transcendence with a grim expression. Qin Zhong chuckled. To think that junior sister Beiming would be able to attract the perfected one heavenly tribulation even without condensing a Dao fruit. That master of hers was right after all. Wang Dong and the others did not say anything and looked at Beiming Shui in the tribulation transcendence with strange expressions. Qin Zhong followed everyone's gaze and looked at the center of the tribulation transcendence. His expression could not help but change. At that moment, it was already the 9th heavenly tribulation of the 3rd level. A green sea of lightning had already formed around Beiming Shui. It was blinding and stirred up massive waves with a terrifying might. As for Beiming Shui, she stood on the spot the entire time without moving or even drawing her weapon. Well, Qin Zhong was secretly speechless and could not help but ask, junior sister Beiming actually underwent tribulation transcendence like that? Wang Dong said, junior sister Beiming cultivates the martial Dao and her physique is indeed strong. According to what I know, in the history of the 8 Sword Peaks, there were very few paragons who could withstand the first 3 perfected one heavenly tribulations with their bodies. Junior brother Yun of Extreme Sword Peak was almost the peak of that. As everyone discussed, the 3rd heavenly tribulation had already ended and the 4th heavenly tribulation descended. Beiming Shui still did not defend and underwent tribulation transcendence with her body. This was Su Zimo's requirement for her. The martial Dao used itself as the world to cultivate continuously. The process of tribulation transcendence was also a form of cultivation and it was a rare opportunity. This was the only way to release the full potential of her body and bloodline to the greatest extent. Boom, boom, boom. Amidst the exclamations of everyone, Beiming Shui endured the first 4 heavenly tribulations head-on. Of course, it was not easy for her either. There were already some injuries on her body and she was charred from the heavenly tribulations and looked a little disheveled. In the blink of an eye, the 5th level of the perfected one heavenly tribulation descended. Beiming Shui had yet to release her divine powers, secret skills, or defend with her sword. Is junior sister Beiming crazy? Qin Zhong could not help but say, if she continues like this and is severely injured, how can she defend against the subsequent heavenly tribulations? Sword Immortal Tai Lai sighed as well. Previously, junior brother Yun Ting almost died when he endured the 5th level of the perfected one heavenly tribulation with his body. Wang Dong and the others had nervous expressions and stared fixedly without saying a word. Boom, boom, boom. The 5th level of the perfected one heavenly tribulation smashed down one after another and Beiming Shui gradually could not hold on any longer. Her flesh was lacerated by the power of the heavenly tribulation and she bled profusely. She was knocked down time and time again and struggled to stand up. The 9th heavenly tribulation of the 5th level even pierced through her chest, revealing a bowl-sized hole that was extremely shocking. Finally, the 5th level of the perfected one heavenly tribulation dissipated. As for Beiming Shui, she laid motionless in the charred pit. At that moment, The hearts of all the sword cultivators tightened. Even the 8 peak masters on the peak of Carnage Sword Peak could not help but stand up and look over with nervous expressions. Isn't junior sister Beiming too hard on herself? Yun Ting was secretly speechless. Back when he transcended the 5th level of the Perfected One Heavenly Tribulation, he also endured it head-on and almost died. Furthermore, that was with the fact that his physique and bloodline were strong to begin with. His bloodline was filled with the power of sword blood and lightning. Therefore, a portion of the power of the 5th level of the Perfected One Heavenly Tribulation was absorbed by his body and bloodline, and he was lucky enough to survive. What did junior sister Beiming have to back her? That martial Dao. Right then, Beiming Shue's body moved and she crawled out of the huge pit slowly. Her face was pale, but she was expressionless with a firm gaze, as though she could not feel any pain. Her wound was filled with boundless life force and the blood hole in her chest was healing rapidly. Chapter 2753, Chapter 2753 Myriad Sword Hum. Chapter 2753 Myriad Sword Hum. What a powerful life force. On the peak of Carnage Sword Peak, the Peak Masters could not help but exclaim when they saw that. This doesn't seem like Beiming Shue's own recovery ability. Someone must have sealed a huge amount of life force in her body in advance. Who can possess such a strong life force and seal it in another person's body? Even we can't do such a thing. The 8 Peak Masters exchanged glances. Instinctively, the gaze of the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak landed on the green-robed cultivator in the crowd and he murmured, "Could it be him?" To be fair, the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak did not take this person from the heavenly world seriously at first. He was just a convergence perfected immortal after all. Because he was worried that Beiming Shue would be dragged down by this person, the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak even looked down on him somewhat. However, when he saw that Beiming Shue had a chance of becoming a perfected immortal, the attitude of the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak towards this person gradually changed. At that moment, he even guessed that the person who sealed life force in Beiming Shue was Su Zhu. Of course, Su Zimo was the only one who had such methods. Su Zimo sighed gently when he saw Beiming Shue struggling to stand up. Although they both cultivated the martial Dao, Beiming Shue's physique and bloodline were way inferior to the martial Dao prime body. Firstly, the prime body was the founder of the martial Dao. Secondly, the martial spirit of the martial Dao prime body was a flame that tempered his flesh at all times. It could even smelt divine powers and secret skills and fuse them into his flesh. Thirdly, the two of them had different experiences. The body of the martial Dao prime body was not only made of flesh and blood, it was also a furnace that had smelted too many divine powers, secret skills, and taboo mystic classics. As for Beiming Shue's martial spirit, it was her sword. Beiming Shue's greatest advantage was in the sword Dao. In fact, Beiming Shue's physique and bloodline were inferior even when compared to the Green Lotus True Body. Back when the Green Lotus True Body underwent the Tribulation Transcendence, he stood on the spot motionlessly and endured the first 6 Perfected One Heavenly Tribulations with his body unscathed. Furthermore, the Green Lotus True Body possessed a terrifying self-healing power. Seeing that the 6th level of the Perfected One Heavenly Tribulation was about to descend, Su Zimo shouted, "Beiming, draw your sword." He had once told Beiming Shue that the more heavenly tribulations she endured with her body, the more beneficial it would be for the cultivation of the martial Dao. However, at that moment, he saw that Beiming Shue had already reached her limit. If she continued to undergo tribulation transcendence with her body, there was a high chance that she would collapse in the 6th level of the Perfected One Heavenly Tribulation. Beiming Shue turned around and looked at Su Zimo from afar with a firm and unyielding gaze, shaking her head gently. This was her choice. Boom. The 6th level of the Perfected One Heavenly Tribulation descended. Beiming Shue stomped her feet and soared into the skies. Like an unsheathed sword, she shone with a cold glint and charged towards the heavenly tribulation in a bedazzling manner. Boom. Beiming Shue collided with the heavenly tribulation and fell rapidly, landing heavily on the ground. She coughed out large mouthfuls of blood. However, she did not retreat, fear or submit. Instead, she continued to charge forward with indomitable will. This was the martial Dao. This was Beiming Xue's sword Dao. It was just like back in Beiming town in Tianhuang mainland. Even though her dantian was shattered and her clansmen suffered and were bullied, she did not submit, admit defeat, or give up. No one could shake her will. The heavenly tribulation could penetrate her chest but not her heart of the sword. At that moment, the 8 peak masters on the mountain peak were moved. Many sword cultivators in the world felt a shock that touched the depths of their souls and their blood seemed to be burning. Many sword cultivators were convinced by her spirit of the sword Dao. Looking at the unyielding figure, they felt a long-lost feeling of gratitude and tears welled up in their eyes. This scene was familiar. It was the same way they watched Beiming Xue go against the Sword Qi waterfall at the foot of Carnage Sword Peak stubbornly. Boom! 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 Beiming Xue fell time and time again and landed on the ground before standing up again. Her body was already in tatters and her original appearance could not be seen. However, she still did not give in and pressed forward. Boom! The 8th heavenly tribulation of the 6th level descended. The heavenly tribulation almost split Beiming Xue into two. A gigantic wound slashed down diagonally from Beiming Xue's shoulder blade and her internal organs spilled all over the ground in a shocking manner. Beiming Xue lay on her back in the huge pit, her body mangled and motionless, as though she was no longer breathing. The 9th heavenly tribulation of the 6th level was still being nurtured and could descend at any moment. Right then, all the sword cultivators held their breaths and focused. They looked at the figure in the pit and clenched their fists instinctively, hoping for a miracle. Suddenly, Beiming Xue moved. Expressionless, she sat up slowly and placed her internal organs back into her body. The life force Su Zimo sealed in her body was almost depleted and although her wounds were still healing, the speed had slowed down. Beiming Xue pursed her lips and used all her strength to support her broken body bit by bit. Every time she moved, her body would tremble slightly, as though she was enduring immense pain. Finally, Beiming Xue stood up once more and looked up at the firmaments. Her body was like a sword and her gaze was sharp as one. At that moment, many sword cultivators on Carnage Sword Continent could not help but cheer. Everyone was happy for Beiming Xue from the bottom of their hearts and celebrated for her. The peak masters of the 8 sword peaks heaved a sigh of relief as well. However, at the same time, the 8 peak masters were worried that Beiming Xue would not be able to survive the 9th heavenly tribulation of the 6th level if she continued. Buzz! Buzz! Right then, the sound of swords rang out from the direction of Myriad Sword Palace, reverberating through the world like the clash of metal. The 8 peak masters widened their eyes as though they had thought of something. Their hearts skipped a beat and they revealed looks of disbelief as they looked over instinctively. This is hum of the sword steely. The 8 peak masters exclaimed. The moment those words spread, it caused a huge commotion in the crowd. The reason why Myriad Sword Palace was known as the center of the sword world and was surrounded by the 8 sword peaks was because there was a sword stele erected in Myriad Sword Palace called the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele. This Zenith Heaven Sword Stele was established by Great Emperor Zenith Heaven of the sword world in the past. It was engraved with the taboo mystic classic passed down by that great emperor. Ever since this Zenith Heaven Sword Stele was established, it had hummed a total of 2 times. The first time was when Great Emperor Zenith Heaven became a great emperor. He resonated with the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele and it hummed. The second time was when Emperor Immortal Vanquishing created the 3 great sword arts when he was an immortal king. The derivation of a peerless divine power resonated with the sword stele and it hummed. And now, it was the 3rd time. Beiming Xue did not create any divine powers or secret skills nor did she advance to the Emperor realm. However, the martial will and sword Dao spirit that she had just revealed was recognized by the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele and a hum was produced. Immediately after, the swords on the waists, backs and even storage bags of all the sword cultivators of the 8 sword peaks and the entire sword world trembled involuntarily. The hum of the sword stele drew in a myriad sword hum. The Zenith Heaven Sword Stele was awakened by Beiming Xue and let out the sword hum to cheer her on. At that moment, Beiming Xue's aura reached its peak. Chapter 2754, Chapter 2754 Born for the Sword. Chapter 2754 Born for the Sword. After the sword hum sounded from the zenith heaven sword steely, a commotion and excitement sounded from the depths of Myriad Sword Palace, and a few terrifying auras were released inadvertently. On the peak of Carnage Sword Peak, the 8 peak masters looked in the direction of Myriad Sword Palace with smiles and gratified expressions. The other sword cultivators could not sense it yet, but the 8 of them could sense that the Emperor experts of Myriad Sword Palace were alarmed by the commotion here. Among them, a few old fellows even woke up. Generally speaking, sword cultivators of the sword world could only enter Myriad Sword Palace to continue cultivating after reaching the Emperor realm. To think that even those few would be alarmed. The Peak Master of 5 Elements Sword Peak lamented. The Zenith Heaven Sword Steely has only hummed a total of 3 times. How can those few be indifferent towards it? The Peak Master of Fiend Sword Peak said. The Peak Master of Tyrant Sword Peak burst into laughter. These old fellows sure can hold it in. To think that they still can't let go of their pride as emperors and are still refusing to show themselves. Even if they don't appear, they will pay attention to Bei Ming Xue's tribulation transcendence in Myriad Sword Palace and protect her. Bei Ming Xue's tribulation transcendence this time round is truly the center of attention. Even I'm looking forward to how many levels of the heavenly tribulation she can attract. To be able to obtain the recognition of the Zenith Heaven Sword Steely, do you think she'll attract the 9 of Nin? The moment that was said, the hearts of the 8 peak masters skipped a beat and anticipation flashed through their eyes. The legendary 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation. They had lived for hundreds of thousands of years but had never seen the appearance of the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation. There was an emperor expert in Myriad Sword Palace right now who once attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation. However, that was millions of years ago. Even Lin Xuanzhen and Yun Ting, who were extremely talented in the sword Dao in this generation, only attracted the 8 of 9 heavenly tribulation. The Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak said in a deep voice, "A few perfected 1 heavenly tribulations can't prove anything. Most of the Emperor experts of the Trichiliocosm merely reached the 7 and 8 of 9 previously. It would be best if Bei Ming Xue can attract the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation. Even if it's only at the 8 of 9 heavenly tribulation, she's still the sword cultivator with the greatest potential in this generation of the sword world." The heavenly tribulation continued. A sword hum sounded from the Zenith Heaven Sword Steely, followed by the Myriad Sword hum. Bei Ming Xue welcomed the 9th heavenly tribulation of the 6th level and slashed forward with indomitable will. In everyone's eyes, Bei Ming Xue's figure seemed to have vanished and was replaced by a sword that seemed to be able to penetrate everything. Boom! Under Bei Ming Xue's persistence, she managed to endure the first 6 perfected 1 heavenly tribulations head-on with her body in the end. With the power of the first 6 levels of the heavenly tribulations, her true martial Dao body was also rapidly reconstructed. The martial Dao runes mixed with the heavenly tribulation lightning fused into her body and bloodline continuously, stimulating the potential of her body. Without giving Bei Ming Xue much time to catch her breath, the 7th level of the perfected 1 heavenly tribulation arrived instantly. This time round, Bei Ming Xue no longer chose to defend head-on. Instead, she released the divine powers and secret skills she had learned over the years to face the 7 of 9 heavenly tribulation. Boom! 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 Under the destructive lightning, a figure that emitted endless sharpness charged against the lightning continuously and challenged the heavenly tribulation, displaying an unshakable will. The 7th level of the perfected 1 heavenly tribulation ended. However, the tribulation clouds in the sky had yet to dissipate. Unsurprisingly, the 8th level of the perfected 1 heavenly tribulation descended. This time round, Bei Ming Xue summoned her destiny sword and revealed her comprehension of the sword Dao under countless gazes. Bei Ming Xue's martial spirit was a sword. It was as if she was born for the sword Dao. To Bei Ming Xue, there was no such thing as being one with the sword or being born with sword blood. Her existence was in itself a supreme immortal sword that could slash through the world. Every single move and stance of hers matched her sword Dao perfectly. However, the 8 of 9 heavenly tribulation was way too powerful. Back then, Yun Ting almost died under the impact of the 8 of 9 heavenly tribulation. If Su Zimo had not arrived here and used the Green Lotus bloodline to nourish Beiming Shue's physique and bloodline for 3 years, she would not have been able to survive. She was struck down time and time again before standing up to face the heavenly tribulation. Finally, the 8 of 9 heavenly tribulation ended. Beiming Shui lay on the ground, charred black. The surface of her body was cracked like the ground after a long drought, and she no longer looked human. Many sword cultivators heaved a sigh of relief. It was over. Wang Dong and the others heaved a sigh of relief as well. Although Beiming Shui looked severely injured, it was clear that her body was still emitting life force. As long as she recuperated for a period of time, she would be able to recover. Wang Dog was concerned. Together with some sword cultivators of Carnage Sword Peak, he wanted to head forward to help Beiming Shui up. However, the Immortal King experts guarding the surroundings had grim expressions and blocked any sword cultivators from advancing. On the mountain peak, the 8 peak masters looked at the firmaments above Beiming Shui with grim expressions as well. Their spirit consciousnesses were strong and they could sense it even more clearly. Although the tribulation clouds dissipated after the 8 of 9 heavenly tribulation, they were showing signs of gathering again and making a comeback. The heavenly tribulation was not over yet. The 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation, the 8 peak masters exchanged glances and thought of that possibility at the same time. At that moment, the sword cultivators of Carnage Sword Continent gradually noticed something amiss as well. They raised their heads one after another and looked at the tribulation clouds that condensed once more in the sky, exclaiming, "Heavens, could it be the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation? That must be the case. Even though I'm already at the celestial being realm, I feel my heart skip a beat against the aura emitted by the tribulation clouds. The 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation is unprecedented. To think that I, Qin Zhong, would be lucky enough to see it in my life. Junior sister Beiming's condition is already very bad. Even the 8 of 9 heavenly tribulation is so difficult. How can she survive the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation?" Wang Dong was worried. Throughout history, there were also some monster incarnates who were destroyed by the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation and could not survive. In a flash, the peak master of Sever Sword Peak tore through the air. The other peak masters were confused and did not know why the peak master of Sever Sword Peak left in a sudden. Before long, the peak master of Sever Sword Peak appeared once more. The peak master of Sever Sword Peak pointed ahead and said in a deep voice, "The 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation is extremely rare in this world. You shouldn't want to miss it." Beside her was a pitilessly beautiful woman with a cold expression. It was the number 1 sword immortal among legacy disciples, Lin Xuanzhen. "Master, what are you doing?" Lin Xuanzhen asked indifferently. Initially, she was in seclusion. However, the peak master of Sever Sword Peak barged in and forcefully brought her here. The peak master of Sever Sword Peak pointed ahead and said in a deep voice, "The 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation is extremely rare in this world. You shouldn't want to miss it." Suddenly, Lin Xuanzhen's heart skipped a beat. The 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation? She knew very well what the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation stood for. It was said that a peerless divine power would descend with the 9th 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation. In theory, everyone who witnessed this peerless divine power personally had a chance of cultivating it successfully. Up till now, she had only cultivated the immortal vanquishing sword to the quasi-peerless level, and it had yet to reach the level of an actual peerless divine power. She had comprehended it for many years and felt that there was something missing. If she could witness the peerless divine power, the immortal vanquishing sword with her own eyes, she would definitely be able to comprehend its profundities and succeed. Of course, the prerequisite was that the peerless divine power that descended from the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation was the immortal vanquishing sword.
BA4AB1A12660039995A15580C9BA7C3B3BB18060B3BB18060A1A1A86209C9.
Chapter 2755, Chapter 2755 A Sword of Frost. Chapter 2755 A Sword of Frost. I wonder what peerless divine power will descend. The Peak Master of Extreme Sword Peak murmured softly. The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak said, "Peerless divine powers are extremely rare and there have only been slightly more than 10 of them since ancient times. Beiming Shui cultivates the sword Dao. As such, there's a high chance that the immortal vanquishing sword will descend." Beiming Shui. Lin Xuanzhen murmured softly. She focused on cultivating the sword Dao and rarely cared about the people and matters between the 8 sword peaks. As such, she was a little unfamiliar with that name. Hey! Lin Xuanzhen seemed to have discovered something and frowned slightly. Suddenly, she asked, "Junior Sister Beiming did not condense a Dao fruit. Why would a perfected one heavenly tribulation descend?" The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak said, "It's said that Beiming Shui cultivates a dharmic formulation called the martial Dao that's different from the immortal, Buddhist and fiend Daos." Martial Dao? Why have I never heard of it? Lin Xuanzhen asked again. The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak said, "This martial Dao was created by Beiming Shui's master in the lower worlds. This person is truly an anomaly. He took another path and created such a dharmic Dao. To think that he could cultivate it to this extent." As the few of them spoke, the 9th level of the perfected one heavenly tribulation had already descended. The first 3 heavenly tribulations of the 9th level are similar to the previous 8 levels. However, their strength has increased significantly. If you want to survive them, you have to release your bloodline phenomenon. Beiming Shui stood on the spot, recalling everything Su Zimo had told her about the 9th level of the perfected one heavenly tribulation. Gradually, she tightened her grip on her sword with a determined gaze. "Fight!" Beiming Shui flicked her sword and hummed. The blood qi in her body surged and the sound of a tsunami sounded. Immediately after, a dragon's roar and elephant's trumpeting sounded from her bloodline, shaking the world. This was the 9th transformation of the martial Dao, the Dragon Elephant Force. Divine dragons circled and divine elephants appeared to protect Beiming Shui, colliding with the first heavenly tribulation of the 9th level with an earth-shaking bang. There were millions of people in Tianhuang mainland who cultivated the martial Dao. However, no one could reach Beiming Shui's achievements in the martial Dao. That was because at the beginning of Beiming Shui's cultivation of the martial Dao, Su Zimo was the one who personally imparted the Dao to her, helping her build a perfect foundation. At the 6th transformation of the martial Dao, one could condense a blood qi golden core. However, Su Zimo let Beiming Shui continue cultivating and only began to condense her martial spirit after cultivating the 9th transformation of the martial Dao, the Dragon Elephant Force. If not for the firm foundation she had built back then, Beiming Shui would not have been able to survive the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation now. The 2nd heavenly tribulation of the 9th level descended. The divine dragons and divine elephants were only phenomenons manifested by the martial Dao and not her bloodline phenomenon. They had already been destroyed by the first heavenly tribulation of the 9th level. Beiming Shui channeled her blood qi to its limits and a dark and deep ocean appeared behind her, emitting a bone-chilling coldness. Beiming Ocean. Beiming Shui released her bloodline phenomenon and endured the 2nd heavenly tribulation of the 9th level head-on. Beiming Ocean was shattered by the heavenly tribulation and was almost dry. Beiming Shui spat out a mouthful of blood. Although more than half of the power of the heavenly tribulation had been resolved by Beiming Ocean, a portion of the terrifying heavenly tribulation still surged into her body. Before she could catch her breath, the 3rd heavenly tribulation of the 9th level descended. Beiming Shui pursed her lips and endured the pain as she continued circulating her bloodline. A gigantic shadow appeared in the initially dry Beiming Ocean. Suddenly, the shadow broke out of the waters and charged towards the 3rd heavenly tribulation of the 9th level. It was a gigantic creature that blotted out the skies in midair. It opened its gigantic mouth and emitted an ancient and terrifying aura, the Kuan race. Many sword cultivators recognized the origin of the gigantic creature and exclaimed, "Boom!" The 3rd heavenly tribulation of the 9th level dissipated. Beiming Shui's bloodline phenomenon was shattered as well and she coughed out large mouthfuls of blood. Her aura was weak and she could no longer hold on. The 4th heavenly tribulation is called the bloodline tribulation and will directly affect your bloodline. Beiming Shui recalled what Su Zimo had said to her and tried her best to calm down to defend against the impact of the bloodline tribulation. Right in front of everyone, Beiming Shui's body trembled continuously and she curled up, as though she was enduring immense pain. As time passed, Beiming Shui's figure gradually faded and vanished strangely. What remained on the spot was a dark and deep sword. The sword emitted a strange power and no longer fought against the bloodline tribulation. Instead, it chose to devour it. This is. On the mountain peak, the expressions of the 8 peak masters on the sword peak changed with disbelief in their eyes. She comprehended a new sword Dao during the tribulation transcendence. That should be the case. However, this sword Dao coexists with her bloodline and is not perfect and stable enough. Before long, the bloodline tribulation ended. Beiming Shui's figure reappeared. After the 4th bloodline tribulation, not only did her injuries not worsen, they even healed by more than half and her condition was much better. No one knew how to defend against the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation better than Su Zimo. That was because he had experienced it twice alone. He imparted his experience of the 2 tribulation transcendences to Beiming Shui entirely. The following essence spirit tribulation, Dao heart tribulation and karma tribulation did not pose much of a threat to Beiming Shui and were defended by her one after another. It was only when the 8th weapon tribulation descended that Beiming Shui suffered immense damage. Beiming Shui's body was drenched in blood and she swayed. She merely leaned on her destiny sword and stood in a pool of blood with difficulty. There was only one final perfected one heavenly tribulation left. However, everyone knew that the final heavenly tribulation was the most terrifying and fatal. The pressure in the world became incomparably oppressive. On the mountain peak and in midair, all the sword cultivators held their breaths and stared fixedly at the tribulation clouds in the skies. The final heavenly tribulation was a peerless divine power and they were lucky enough to witness it. This was also an opportunity for them. In fact, the few powerful auras in Myriad Sword Palace became extremely quiet, afraid of disturbing Beiming Shui. Only the Zenith Heaven Sword Steely was still emitting sword hums, seemingly boosting Beiming Shui's aura. Lin Xuanjun and Yun Ting were also looking forward to the next scene. Suddenly, peach blossoms of different colors floated down from the tribulation clouds in the sky. They were white, red and pink and emitted a faint fragrance. The fragrance was not strong, but the surrounding sword cultivators felt a little dazed when they smelled it and looked intoxicated. Even most perfected immortal sword cultivators were not spared. Only the 8 peak masters on the mountain peak had solemn expressions. They could clearly see that although the peach blossoms looked ordinary, they were condensed from sword chi and every single one of them contained terrifying lethality. If it's not the immortal vanquishing sword, what peerless divine power is it? This looks like a divine power of the sword Dao, but it doesn't seem to have appeared before. A new peerless divine power has descended. When the 8 peak masters thought of that, they were shocked. Right then, the peach blossom rain descended continuously and formed words in the sky. A sky of intoxicating flowers, a sword of frost. Everyone read it out instinctively. Zing. A sword hum sounded. Amidst the peach blossoms that filled the sky, a stunning and resplendent sword light appeared with an extremely sharp sword intent. Like lightning that tore through the night sky, it entered Beiming Shui's body instantly. Chapter 2756, Chapter 2756, Peerless Standoff. Chapter 2756, Peerless Standoff. The moment the sword light arrived, a torrential sword intent burst forth from within Beiming Shui's body and the killing intent shook the entire world. A sword that was scarlet as blood flew out from Beiming Shui's body and took the sword light head-on. Immortal vanquishing sword. An exclamation sounded from the crowd. On the mountain peak, the 8 peak masters were astounded as well. Although the immortal vanquishing sword was not at the level of a peerless divine power, it was already a quasi-peerless divine power. Boom! The 2 sword Daos collided. A moment later, the tribulation clouds dissipated. The world was silent. All the sword cultivators, including the immortal kings present and the 8 peak masters on the peak of Carnage Sword Peak, were stunned on the spot, convinced by the sword intent revealed by that sword strike. There were no words that could describe the amazement of that strike. Perhaps, everything could only be found in those words revealed. A sky of intoxicating flowers, a sword of frost. A new peerless divine power had descended upon the sword world because of Beiming Shui. On the mountain peak, Lin Xuanzhen's calm eyes rippled as well and her heart skipped a beat. Yun Ting clenched his fists with a conflicted expression. Although Beiming Shui attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation, that alone could not affect him much. The heavenly tribulation was only on the surface. Cultivators of the 8 of 9 heavenly tribulation might not lose to those of the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation in the future. It was said that when the strongest emperor expert in the world, Demon Empress Blood Butterfly of the Great Wilderness, entered the perfected one realm, she only attracted the 5 of 9 heavenly tribulation. Generally speaking, after living beings condensed their Tao fruits, they could at least attract the 6 of 9 heavenly tribulation. However, Demon Empress Blood Butterfly was so weak back then that even the 6 of 9 heavenly tribulation did not appear. Even so, later on, she still stood at the peak of the upper world and looked down on all living beings. Yun Ting was only one perfected one heavenly tribulation beneath Beiming Shui that could not shake his Tao heart. However, when he saw the sword strike earlier on, he was still deeply shocked. He could not describe how terrifying that strike was. He only knew that if he was in Beiming Shui's shoes, he would most probably not be able to defend against that sword strike. Everyone's gazes were on Beiming Shui. She seemed to be in an extremely bad state. Not only was her life force weak, even her essence spirit in her consciousness was severely injured and was almost shattered. It's over. Sensing everything, many sword cultivators shook their heads and sighed. Yun Ting's eyes flashed with pity as well. Right then, a green figure flashed and arrived beside Beiming Shui. It was Su Zimo. Su Zimo went forward with a grim expression and carried the unconscious Beiming Shui, prepared to return to her cave abode. The next moment, the void at the side suddenly split open and an incomparably domineering aura descended. The Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak had arrived. Put her down and hand her over to me. The Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak stopped Su Zimo with a cold glint in his eyes and a powerful might that crushed towards Su Zimo. No. Su Zimo spoke slowly with a fearless expression. His tone was firm and unquestionable. Even against an immortal king expert, Su Zimo met his gaze without dodging at all. The jaws of the surrounding sword cultivators dropped slightly. At that moment, everyone seemed to have an illusion that Su Zimo was not at a disadvantage in terms of aura in his confrontation with the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak. Who's that? On the mountain peak, Lin Xuanzhen's gaze landed on Su Zimo and she suddenly asked. The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak said, his Beiming Shui's master in the lower worlds. Lin Xuanzhen nodded slightly. Sigh. Suddenly, the Peak Master of 5 Elements Sword Peak sighed. Brother Lu is a little worked up because he's overly concerned. Beiming Shui is so severely injured that even her essence spirit is almost shattered. Even the emperors of Myriad Sword Palace can't do anything for her, let alone us. The Peak Master of Illusory Sword Peak nodded as well. If they could save her, those old fellows would have appeared a long time ago. Amitabh her. The Peak Master of Zen Sword Peak said, we should step in to talk to Brother Lu lest he injures Beiming Shui's master in a moment of impulse. After all, this has nothing to do with her master. What did you say? When the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak saw that Su Zimo actually dared to oppose him, he could not help but feel enraged. The sword light in his eyes became even sharper and was about to spew out. Can you save her? Su Zimo asked instead with a calm expression. I. The Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak was stumped for words and was stunned on the spot. Indeed, he could not save Beiming Shui. However, he truly did not want her to die prematurely. He had to give it a try with everything he could no matter what. Since you can't save her, don't block the way. Right then, Su Zimo said, I'll save my own disciple. No one else is to disturb me for a month. With that said, Su Zimo carried Beiming Shui towards the cave abode. When he heard that, the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak could not believe it. However, A trace of hope reignited in his heart and he moved aside instinctively. In the blink of an eye, Su Zimo carried Beiming Shui and disappeared from everyone's sight. The Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak stood on the spot with a conflicted expression. After pondering for a long time, he took a deep look in the direction where Su Zimo and Beiming Shui left before turning to leave. On the mountain peak, Lin Xuanjun had already left and returned to Sever Sword Peak to continue her seclusion. Although she did not see the descent of the Immortal vanquishing sword this time round, that new peerless divine power still shocked her greatly. She wanted to enter seclusion as soon as possible to absorb and refine her comprehension as much as possible. Brother Lu, let's let him give it a shot. The Peak Master of Five Elements Sword Peak sighed. Even if you take Beiming Shui away, you'll probably have to watch her die in front of you in the end. The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak said, that's right. Even if he can't save her, Beiming Shui is still his disciple. He should be the one to send her off on her final journey. The Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak was silent. He looked at Beiming Shui's cave abode from afar with a hint of anticipation. Upon returning to the cave abode, Su Zimo activated the surrounding immortal formations immediately and blocked the entire cave abode. Along the way, he had already checked Beiming Shui's injuries from head to toe. Beiming Shui was indeed severely injured and her life was on the line. The most terrifying thing was that Beiming Shui's essence spirit, which was the sword soul in her consciousness, suffered a huge impact and was almost shattered. However, Su Zimo could see clearly that the final sword strike of the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation was not fatal. In fact, it left Beiming Shui with a trace of life. This was completely different from the 2 tribulation transcendences he underwent back then. Back when he attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation twice, the final heavenly tribulations were completely aimed at destroying him. However, when the sword light from the peerless divine power of the sword Dao entered Beiming Shui's body at the last moment, it left a trace of life to save her life temporarily. As long as there was a trace of life, Su Zimo had a way to save Beiming Shui. Relying on the bloodline of the grade 12 creation Green Lotus, if he used the Lotus Life Finger for a month, he could heal Beiming Shui's injuries completely. As for the sword soul injuries that were the most difficult to resolve, he had some Sakara fruits in his storage bag that he could feed her. If one won't do, he would use 2. If he chanted the texts from the Prajna Nirvana Sutra at the same time to nourish Beiming Shui's sword soul, there was a 70% chance he could heal her completely. The grade 12 creation Green Lotus that possessed an incomparably rich life force was the only possibility of saving Beiming Shui, who was on the brink of death. Upon recovering, Beiming Shui had a chance of comprehending 2 peerless divine powers. Chapter 2757, Chapter 2757, Return of the Sword Arts. Chapter 2757, Return of the Sword Arts. After the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation dissipated, many sword cultivators returned to their respective sword peaks. This observation allowed most sword cultivators to gain many new insights into the sword Dao. If anyone in the world could attract the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation, it would be a rare opportunity for the cultivators of the entire world. On the peak of Carnage Sword Peak, the 8 peak masters gathered here and recalled the scene of Beiming Shui undergoing tribulation transcendence earlier on. They sighed endlessly. If I'm not wrong, Beiming Shui should have the original ancient scrolls of the 3 great sword arts in her storage bag, the peak master of Sever Sword Peak said in a deep voice. The others were not surprised when they heard that. The 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation was way too powerful. Not only was Beiming Shui's body severely injured, her storage bag was almost shattered as well. Through the shattered storage bag, the 8 peak masters sensed the auras of the 3 sword arts. Furthermore, it was the most primitive and purest sword chi of the 3 great sword art. The peak master of 5 elements Sword Peak nodded as well. Although her immortal vanquishing sword has yet to reach the level of a peerless divine power, it's at the quasi-peerless level. There's no mistake about that divine charm and sword intent she possessed. The peak master of Carnage Sword Peak said, I've been paying attention to her cultivation. At the very least, she was still unable to fuse the 3 great sword arts and condense the immortal vanquishing sword 3 years ago. The reason why she could cultivate the immortal vanquishing sword should be because she read the original ancient scrolls of the three great sword arts. The peak master of illusory sword peak lamented, Beiming Shui is truly blessed. To think that she could obtain the first version of the three great sword arts. The peak master of Carnage Sword Peak had a puzzled expression. However, she has been cultivating in Carnage Sword Peak for the past 3 years and has never left. How could she have obtained the three sword arts? 3 years ago. The peak masters of the 8 sword peaks exchanged glances and thought of the same person at the same time. 3 years ago was when Su Zhu of the heavenly world arrived. Could he have imparted it to Beiming Shui? In that case, he should have cultivated the three great sword arts as well. To be able to impart the first version of the three great sword arts to Beiming Shui, it's clear that he values her immensely. Even personal disciples might not be able to see the first versions of cultivation techniques like the three great sword arts. Furthermore, Su Zimo handed the first version of the three great sword arts to Beiming Shui right away. And no matter what, the first version of the three great sword arts has been lost for many years. It's finally back in the hands of a cultivator of the sword world in this generation. If Su Zhu really imparted the three great sword arts to Beiming Shui, brother Lu, you should meet him and thank him in person. The significance of the return of the three great sword arts to the sword world is way too great. In reality, the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak knew the importance of this matter as well. However, he was an immortal king after all, and Su Zhu was only a perfected immortal. He was still a little prideful and resistant to the idea of that. Furthermore, Beiming Shui's fate was unknown. Even if the three great sword arts were returned, he was not in the mood. The peak master of Carnage Sword Peak said, "That's all speculation. If the three great sword arts were really imparted to Beiming Shui by this person, it's nothing for me to thank him. If he can save Beiming Shui, it won't even be a problem for me to prepare a huge gift and hand it to him personally, let alone thank him." This was a monster incarnate of the Sword Tao who attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation and brought about the birth of a new peerless divine power. As long as she could survive, she would definitely be the hope of the sword world in the future. That was something that no gift could be exchanged for. Time flew, and in the blink of an eye, a month had passed. During this period of time, almost all the sword cultivators of the 8 sword peaks were discussing the previous 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation. Wang Dong and the other sword cultivators of Carnage Sword Peak took turns to stand guard outside Beiming Shui's cave abode every day, hoping for some news to come from inside. However, the cave abode was closed the entire time and it was silent inside. Although the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak did not appear, he would look in that direction from time to time. On this day, the door of the cave abode that had been closed for a month opened slowly and a slender figure walked out from the depths of the cave abode. The sword cultivators guarding outside the cave abode looked over immediately and their eyes widened in shock when they saw the figure walking out. Beiming Shui was out of seclusion. The news swept through the 8 sword peaks like a violent storm, causing a huge commotion. Everyone saw Beiming Shui's injuries that day. Even Immortal King experts were helpless. No one expected Beiming Shui to come back to life and recover fully. When Wang Dong and the others received the news, they came to congratulate her immediately. Beiming Shui's advancement to the perfected One Realm meant that she had already become a legacy disciple of the sword world Heekdom. On the mountain peak, Lu Yun, the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak, burst into laughter excitedly. "Ha ha ha ha, the heavens are truly blessing our sword world." Lu Yun looked at the withered lotus flowers on the mountain peak and murmured, "Senior Immortal Vanquishing, did you see that? Our sword world now has a monster incarnate who attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation." Beiming Shui's tribulation transcendence had already ended. However, the withered lotus flowers on the mountain peak did not recover their vitality as he had expected. Even so, Lu Yun was delighted when he saw Beiming Shui return unscathed. At the same time, the peak masters of the other sword peaks received the news as well. Seems like Carnage Sword Peak is going to rise in this generation. With the appearance of Beiming Shui from Carnage Sword Peak and the return of the 3 great sword arts to the sword world, Lu Yun will probably wake up laughing in his dreams. That might not be the case. In this generation, Extreme Sword Peak has Yun Ting and Sever Sword Peak has Lin Xuanzhen. It's still unknown who can walk further on the Sword Dao. Among the legacy disciples of the 8 Sword Peaks, Beiming Shui, Yun Ting and Lin Xuanzhen have all cultivated the immortal vanquishing sword to the level of a quasi-peerless divine power. I wonder who will be the first to comprehend the true immortal vanquishing sword. Although Beiming Shui had obtained the peerless divine power of a sword of frost, it did not mean that she had completely comprehended it. Comprehending and mastering a peerless divine power was as difficult as ascending the heavens. Beiming Shui still had to continue cultivating and comprehending. She needed time to settle down and an opportunity. It could only be said that she was the sword cultivator with the highest chance of comprehending a sword of frost. On the mountain peak, Lu Yun looked at Beiming Shui, who had just walked out of her cave abode and was receiving the congratulations of many sword cultivators in silence. A moment later, he suddenly sent a voice transmission with his spirit consciousness, asking Beiming Shui to come to the peak of Carnage Sword Peak. Firstly, he wanted to test if Beiming Shui could revive the lotus flowers on the mountain peak. Secondly, he had to ask about the matter of the 3 great sword arts. Before long, Beiming Shui ascended the peak of Carnage Sword Peak. This was the first time she was here. A hint of surprise flashed through her eyes as she looked at the large patch of withered lotus flowers around her. Disappointment flashed through Lu Yun's eyes. There was no feedback from the surrounding lotus flowers. Lu Yun put that matter aside for the time being and asked with a smile, Beiming Shui, there's something I want to confirm. Did your master impart the 3 great sword arts to you? At the mention of the 3 great sword arts and Su Zimo, Beiming Shui suddenly looked wary. Lu Yun smiled. Don't be nervous. Since the 3 great sword arts are with you, they belong to you. No one can take them away without your permission. As for your master, I won't hurt him either. In fact, if he was the one who imparted the 3 great sword arts to you, I'll have to prepare a gift to thank him in person. Chapter 2758, Chapter 2758, Battle of Monster Incarnates. Chapter 2758, Battle of Monster Incarnates. Beiming Shui knew that she could not hide this from the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak. She also believed that the other party would keep his promise and not harm Su Zimo. Only then did she nod. The 3 great sword arts were indeed imparted to me by Master. Indeed. Lu Yun nodded slightly in silence. In that case, he should indeed meet Su Zhu and thank him in person. However, he was in a dilemma as to what gift to prepare. If the gift was insignificant, it would seem impolite, as though he did not take this matter seriously at all. However, Su Zhu was not from the sword world after all, he was just Beiming Shui's master from the lower worlds. If the gift was too significant, it would be inappropriate too. Lu Yun couldn't think of a way to prepare a sincere and appropriate thank you gift. Of course, he had even more important matters to discuss with Su Zhu. Beiming Shui attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation, which even descended with a new peerless divine power of the Sword Dao. During the tribulation transcendence, she attracted the resonance of the Zenith Heaven Sword Steely to help her. It was no exaggeration to say that Beiming Shui was one of the most important legacy disciples in the sword world. Although she had just entered the perfected One realm, her status in the sword world was definitely not inferior to Lin Xuanzhen and Yun Ting in the hearts of the expert. Right now, Beiming Shui was a convergence perfected immortal. Her master, Su Zhu, should have just broken through to the celestial being realm. The two of them were of similar cultivation realms. In fact, in Lu Yun's opinion, if he removed the restrictions that disallowed cultivators from different cultivation realms from sparring, Beiming Shui would definitely be able to defeat her master. This monster incarnate of the sword world who transcended the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation and had a chance of comprehending 2 peerless divine powers could definitely fight above her level. That way, the relationship between the two of them would seem awkward. In Lu Yun's opinion, Su Zhu was no longer qualified to continue imparting the Dao to Beiming Shui. Beiming Shui's master had to be an immortal king at least. The orisons and knowledge of immortal kings and their understanding of Dharmic Dao were far from what a perfected immortal could compare to. Even ordinary immortal kings were not suitable. Only a peak immortal king, a peak master, such as himself could be qualified to be Bei Ming Xue's master. Furthermore, Bei Ming Xue cultivated the sword Dao after all. Even if Su Zhu cultivated the three great sword arts, how could he compare to her in the sword Dao? If that was the case, what could this person teach Bei Ming Xue? Of course, Lu Yun could not say that in front of Bei Ming Xue. He could vaguely sense that Bei Ming Xue was extremely respectful and reliant on Su Zhu. He wanted to make use of this opportunity to talk to Su Zhu about this. If this person withdrew voluntarily, it would be a better choice for Bei Ming Xue. Peak Master, if there's nothing else, I'll take my leave first. Bei Ming Xue said when she saw Lu Yun deep in thought for a long time. Yes. Lu Yun answered before asking casually, where are you going? Extreme Sword Peak. Bei Ming Xue said indifferently. As though he sensed something, Lu Yun caught a hint of sword intent from Bei Ming Xue and asked, why are you going to Extreme Sword Peak? Bei Ming Xue said, I have a battle arranged with Yun Ting. I'm going to settle it now. Well. Lu Yun hesitated for a moment. Bei Ming Xue, you've just transcended the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation and your injuries have just recovered. You haven't cultivated in the perfected one realm yet. I suggest that you cultivate in the perfected one realm for a period of time and familiarize yourself with the battles between perfected immortals. Bei Ming Xue shook her head gently. The reason why I'm fighting Yun Ting is because I want to use him to test my sword and familiarize myself with the battles of perfected immortals. Lu Yun said helplessly, you don't have to look for Yun Ting right away if you just want someone to test your sword. You can do it with a weaker opponent. In Lu Yun's opinion, although Bei Ming Xue had passed the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation, it was hard to say who would win in her fight against Yun Ting. Yun Ting's talent in the sword Dao was also rare in the world. Furthermore, Yun Ting had obtained many sword Dao inheritances and had already cultivated every single sword Dao to greater mastery. Also, Yun Ting had cultivated for a much longer time in the perfected one realm than Bei Ming Xue. Bei Ming Xue had just entered the perfected one realm and her greatest advantage was that she had a chance to comprehend two peerless divine powers in the future. If she looked for Yun Ting now, it would be equivalent to wasting this advantage. More importantly, there was another worry in Lu Yun's heart. Bei Ming Xue cultivated the martial Dao after all and had not even condensed a Dao fruit. Although she had entered the perfected one realm, what chance did Bei Ming Xue have of winning against Yun Ting, a purer perfected immortal with a Dao fruit? As though she could read Lu Yun's concerns, Bei Ming Xue said indifferently, I entered the perfected one realm as a martial Dao cultivator. Since I want to fight, I have to find the strongest among my peers. I'm sure many fellow disciples of the 8 Sword Peaks want to see the combat strength of the martial Dao at the perfected one realm as well. In reality, that was also the case. After knowing that Bei Ming Xue had come out of seclusion, the greatest suspense in the hearts of the sword cultivators was how strong she was after cultivating the martial Dao and entering the perfected one realm. After all, the heavenly tribulation was only external. If Bei Ming Xue's combat strength could not be ranked in the top 10 among her peers, so what if she attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation? It would probably only prove that the martial Dao was worthless. When Lu Yun saw that Bei Ming Xue was determined to leave, he could not persuade her further and could only give her a few reminders. He then explained some of the trump cards that Yun Ting had revealed previously to Bei Ming Xue. After Bei Ming Xue heard that, she turned around and headed towards the teleportation formation, heading straight for Extreme Sword Peak. Lu Yun looked at Bei Ming Xue's back view in silence. In Lu Yun's understanding, the martial Dao was only a dharmic Dao created by a cultivator of the lower worlds after all. It was incomplete and could not compare to dharmic Daos like the Immortal, Buddhist and Fiend Daos that had been passed down through the ages. If the martial Dao was really strong, why did Su Zhu, who created the martial Dao, stop cultivating it? Lu Yun had long observed Su Zhu in secret. Su Zhu's cultivation clearly belonged to the Immortal, Buddhist and Fiend lineages and there was a Dao fruit in his consciousness. Perhaps it's good as well if Bei Ming Xue loses. Lu Yun thought about it. That way, He had even more reason to persuade Su Zhu to let go and let Beiming Shui become his disciple. News of Beiming Shui heading to Extreme Sword Peak to challenge Yunting spread like wildfire. The 8 sword peaks that had just calmed down for a month were in an uproar once more. For many sword cultivators, a battle between 2 peerless monster incarnates of the sword world was much better than the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation. Hurry, let's go to Extreme Sword Peak. Beiming Shui and Yunting are about to fight. Beiming Shui is way too domineering. She wants to spar with junior brother Yun the moment she advances to the perfected one realm. Although Beiming Shui attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation, she doesn't have a Dao fruit. She might not have a high chance of winning against junior brother Yun. Many sword cultivators discussed and made use of the teleportation formations to head towards Extreme Sword Peak. Junior sister Beiming is way too anxious. When Wang Dong found out about this, he could not help but feel worried. He shook his head and sighed. If she cultivates for hundreds or thousands of years and has some comprehension of a sword of frost, even only at the level of a quasi-peerless divine power, she has a 70% chance of winning against junior brother Yun. But now, both of them are in control of Immortal vanquishing sword at the level of a quasi-peerless divine power. However, junior sister Beiming has just entered the perfected one realm. She doesn't have any advantage at all. When the perfected immortal experts of the 8 sword peaks, Wang Dong, Gong Suanyu, Shen Yu, Qin Zhong and the others heard that, they moved as well. Instantly, sword cultivators filled Extreme Sword Peak. The battle between 2 peerless monster incarnates of the sword world was the center of attention. Chapter 2759, Chapter 2759, Won't Die. Chapter 2759, Won't Die. The battle between the 2 monster incarnates attracted the attention of countless sword cultivators. In the sword world, it was not easy to witness a battle between top monster incarnates. For example, Lin Xuanzhen was completely unrivaled among her peers. As for Yun Ting and Lin Xuanzhen, their cultivation realms were significantly different and they could not spar. The reason why this unprecedented battle between 2 people of the same cultivation realm could take place was because Beiming Shui suddenly attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation and advanced to the perfected one realm. This battle was not only between Beiming Shui and Yun Ting. Countless sword cultivators wanted to see what combat strength Beiming Shui could unleash at the perfected one realm with the martial Dao she cultivated. The 8 sword peaks were in an uproar, but Beiming Shui's cave abode was abnormally quiet. Su Zimo did not join in the fun. He knew Beiming Shui and Yun Ting too well and in his opinion, there was no doubt about the outcome. For the past 3 years, he had spent most of his energy on Beiming Shui. Now that Beiming Shui had entered the true martial realm, he was relieved and prepared to continue cultivating and comprehending Dharmic Daos. His cultivation realm increased rapidly and had already caught up, surpassing Yun Ting. However, in reality, he was far from reaching the upper limit of his combat strength. Up till now, Su Zimo had already cultivated the divine powers of the Immortal vanquishing sword, Buddha dragon elephant, 6 paths of reincarnation, fleeting moment, 4 heads 8 arms and 6 tusk divine strength to a quasi-peerless level. However, if he wanted to cultivate a true peerless divine power, he still had to continue comprehending them. Although there was only a difference of a single word, the power released was worlds apart. If Su Zimo could cultivate those divine powers into peerless divine powers, his combat strength would reach its peak. At that time, with the augmentation of 6 tusk divine strength and 4 heads 8 arms, coupled with a few peerless divine powers, it was difficult for him to predict what kind of power he could unleash. Throughout history, no one could master so many peerless divine powers at the same time. More than half a day had passed since Beiming Shui left. Finally, a sound came from the cave abode's door. Before long, a figure walked in slowly. Su Zimo opened his eyes and looked over. Beiming Shui's clothes were a little messy and bloodstained. Her face was slightly pale and her aura was weak. It was clear that she had expended a lot of energy in this battle and had fought extremely hard. However, Beiming Shui's expression was still calm and her gaze was sharp like a sword. "You won?" Su Zimo asked. "I won." Beiming Shui nodded. The master and disciple asked and answered without saying anything else. Su Zimo had long expected this and naturally did not ask further or be curious. Given Bei Ming Xue's personality, she would not show any excitement even if she defeated Yun Ting. Su Zimo closed his eyes and was about to continue cultivating when his heart skipped a beat. He asked curiously, "Is Yun Ting all right?" Bei Ming Xue paused and was silent for a moment before saying, "He won't die." Silence returned to Bei Ming Xue's cave abode. Su Zimo comprehended his dharmic doubts while Bei Ming Xue recuperated quietly. However, Extreme Sword Peak seemed to have exploded at that moment and was filled with commotion. Bei Ming Xue had already returned to her cave abode, but there was still a large number of sword cultivators gathered on Extreme Sword Peak who did not leave for a long time. The battle between the two monster incarnates lasted for more than 4 hours. Everyone witnessed the entire process and the shock on their faces did not dissipate. The killing power of the sword Dao displayed by Bei Ming Xue and Yun Ting during their battle was an eye-opener for everyone present. At the beginning of the battle, perhaps because she was not familiar with the battle between perfected immortals, Bei Ming Xue was at a disadvantage and was suppressed by Yun Ting the entire time. However, as time passed, Bei Ming Xue gradually broke free from her disadvantage. At the end of the battle, Bei Ming Xue counterattacked domineeringly and suppressed Yun Ting completely. In the end, Yun Ting was knocked unconscious by Bei Ming Xue. Sword Immortal Tai Lai and the other peak perfected immortals carried him down before the battle ended. Yun Ting is too pitiful. His face was beaten so badly that he doesn't even resemble a human anymore. Junior sister Bei Ming is way too ruthless. Why does it feel like she has a deep grudge against junior brother Yun? As expected of the monster incarnate who attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation. She suppressed senior brother Yun the moment she entered the perfected one realm. Is this the martial Dao? It's way too strong. Even junior brother Yun's powerful sword blood can't suppress junior sister Bei Ming's blood qi. The sword intent contained in junior sister Bei Ming's blood qi is clearly even more terrifying. However, she doesn't seem to have completely mastered it. How do I cultivate the martial Dao? I wonder if it's too late for me to cultivate the martial Dao now. The outcome of this battle exceeded the expectations of most sword cultivators and caused a huge commotion among the 8 sword peaks. Wang Dong, Gong Suanyu, Qin Zhong and the other peak-perfected immortals had conflicted expressions and were filled with emotions. Wang Dong smiled bitterly. To think that junior sister Bei Ming's combat strength would still be so terrifying without a Dao fruit. Previously, I even persuaded her repeatedly not to cultivate the martial Dao. Now that I think about it, I'm really ashamed. Qin Zhong grinned and clicked his tongue. Junior sister Bei Ming is way too ruthless. She's already invincible among her peers the moment she advanced to the perfected one realm. Gong Suanyu lamented as well. That's right. If junior sister Bei Ming comprehends the peerless divine power of a sword of frost in the future, junior brother Yun will be even more inferior to her. It's not just junior brother Yun. Shun Yu said, if junior sister Bei Ming's cultivation realm catches up to ours, we'll probably not be her match either. On the peak of Extreme Sword Peak. Even I'm a little curious about what the martial Dao is now. From my observations, the martial Dao focuses on the cultivation of the physique and bloodline. Bei Ming Xue's physique and bloodline are so strong that no one of the same cultivation realm can match her. With such a physique and bloodline, coupled with her sword soul, sword Dao and heart of the sword, Bei Ming Xue is like a pure and flawless immortal sword. Congratulations, Brother Lu. The Peak Masters cupped their fists. Carnage Sword Peak will have a chance of leading the 8 Sword Peaks with Bei Ming Xue around. Lu Yun was already overjoyed in his heart, but he still pretended to be calm on the surface and nodded slightly. She has just entered the perfected one realm after all. She's still far from it. Now that Bei Ming Xue has become a perfected immortal, you can officially take her in as a disciple, Brother Lu. The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak said, Bei Ming Xue's talent in the sword Dao is unparalleled. You have to teach her well. At the mention of that, Lu Yun shook his head gently. Bei Ming Xue has no intention of becoming my disciple yet. She seems to still want to cultivate with Su Zhu. How can that be? The peak master of Fiend Sword Peak frowned. Su Zhu's cultivation is similar to Beiming Shui's. Wouldn't he just be dragging her genius down? This is not going to be easy. Lu Yun said in a deep voice, no matter what, Beiming Shui attained her current achievements by cultivating the martial Dao he created. Furthermore, this person even saved Beiming Shui from the verge of death and imparted the first version of the 3 great sword arts to her. From a certain perspective, he's a benefactor to our entire sword world. It would seem rude if I asked him to leave Beiming Shui. Chapter 2760, Chapter 2760, Seeing Through the Mortal World. Chapter 2760, Seeing Through the Mortal World. In the blink of an eye, half a year had passed since the battle between Beiming Shui and Yun Ting. For the past half a year, Su Zimo had been in seclusion in Beiming Shui's cave abode. He enjoyed a rare period of peace after arriving at the Sword World. During this period, no one came to challenge him. On this day, a spirit consciousness fluctuation came from outside the cave abode. Although Su Zimo sensed it, the spirit consciousness fluctuation was a little weak. He remained in a meditative state and did not wake up. Brother Su, Brother Su. After a while, the spirit consciousness fluctuation spread in again cautiously. Yun Ting. Su Zimo opened his eyes. He did not know what Yun Ting was doing here, but he still channeled his spirit consciousness and opened the door of the cave abode. When Yun Ting saw the door of the cave abode open, he did not walk in. Instead, he looked inside from the entrance of the cave abode, looking for something. Su Zimo raised his voice. Brother Yun, what's wrong? Why not come in for a chat? Yun Ting coughed gently and sent a voice transmission with his spirit consciousness. Brother Su, is your disciple inside? Beiming Shui? Su Zimo said, she's not around. She went to Myriad Sword Palace to cultivate. After Beiming Shui became a legacy disciple, she had the chance to head to Myriad Sword Palace and cultivate before the Zenith Heaven Sword Steely to comprehend the taboo mystic classic of the sword world, the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic. The Zenith Heaven Sword Classic was imprinted on the Zenith Heaven Sword Steely. In the sword world, the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic did not belong to anyone. Back then, Great Emperor Zenith Heaven had once passed down an ancient rule that as long as a legacy disciple of the Sword World swore not to impart the Sword Classic privately or betray the Sword World, they could come to the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic to comprehend the Sword Dao. It was also because of Great Emperor Zenith Heaven's ancient rule that the Sword World was one of the strongest worlds in the past few eras. Everyone who read the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic comprehended different Sword Daos according to their different experiences, physiques, bloodlines, and cultivation techniques in the past. From that, the 8 most powerful sword Daos of the sword world were derived, creating the current 8 sword peaks. Oh! When he heard that Beiming Shui was not inside, Yun Ting heaved a sigh of relief. As though it was a load off his shoulders, he relaxed and swaggered into the cave abode. What's the matter, Brother Yun? Su Zimo asked. Just as Yun Ting was about to speak, he suddenly noticed Su Zimo's cultivation realm. His eyes widened and he cried out, your cultivation speed is way too fast. You're already at the celestial being realm? Su Zimo nodded. It's been half a year. During the tribulation transcendence, Yun Ting's attention was on Beiming Shui and he did not notice that Su Zimo had already broken through. Advancement in the perfected one realm was much more difficult than the black, earth, and heaven essence realms. Not only did it require a large amount of heaven and earth essence chi and cultivation resources, it also required a new comprehension of the world. Even with his talent and specialization in the sword Dao, Yun Ting had yet to cultivate to the peak of the convergence realm. However, Su Zimo was already at the celestial being realm. Yun Ting had always treated Su Zimo as his opponent. Even after being defeated by Su Zimo twice, he was not discouraged. However, his loss to Beiming Shui half a year ago had indeed dealt him a considerable blow. Now that he saw that Su Zimo's cultivation realm had already surpassed his heart suffered another blow. The previous 2 times Su Zimo defeated him, Su Zimo's cultivation realm was lower than his. Furthermore, Su Zimo did not release his full strength. At the very least, he did not release the blood chi of the creation green lotus. Yunting's chances were even less if they had fought at the same cultivation realm. But now, Su Zimo's cultivation realm was even higher than his. This meant that there was no way he could defeat Su Zimo. No matter how proud and conceited Yunting was, he could not help but feel discouraged. Su Zimo smiled and changed the topic. "Are you here to spar with Beiming?" He thought that Yunting must have asked about Beiming Shue's whereabouts because he wanted to spar with her. Furthermore, Yunting was belligerent by nature. He would definitely not be willing to admit defeat after losing to Beiming Shue in front of everyone and would find an opportunity to fight again. Unexpectedly, when Yunting heard the words spar with Beiming, he shuddered and said hurriedly, "I'm not looking for her. I'm not sparring with her." Well. Su Zimo was stunned when he saw Yunting's resistance. Yunting was so belligerent and conceited. He actually did not want to regain his dignity after losing once. He had defeated Yunting twice, but Yunting was unconvinced and wanted to spar with him for the third time. Yet, Beiming Shue managed to subdue Yunting in one go? Su Zimo looked at Yunting with a fake smile and asked, "Didn't you want to court Beiming?" "No, no, no." Yunting shook his head like a rattledrum and said with lingering fear, "That crazy woman." The moment he said that, he realized that it was inappropriate. He coughed gently and corrected himself. "That disciple of yours is way too fierce. I can't deal with her. TV had to recuperate for 2 months just after fighting with her. If we become Dao companions in the future, it'll be terrible. I'm afraid I won't be able to live past next year." Su Zimo. Even after half a year, Yunting's face was still filled with deep fear. Suddenly, Su Zimo regretted not watching the battle personally. He did not know what happened in that battle between the two of them to give Yunting such a huge psychological trauma. Su Zimo consoled, "Beiming is not the only woman in the sword world. You can look for other women." "No thanks." Yunting waved it off and winced. "Women are all the same. They're terrifyingly fierce. Although my sister is usually quiet and gentle, she's ruthless when she goes crazy. It's best to just cultivate the sword Dao. I won't have such thoughts in the future. I should just focus on cultivating with my sword. Brother Su, this tribulation is probably a test from the heavens for me. It reminds me that I should focus on cultivating the sword Dao and not let my thoughts run wild." Yunting lamented, as though he had seen through the mortal world and was enlightened. Su Zimo had a strange expression. He could actually sense a Buddhist Zen aura from Yunting. Well. Su Zimo muttered internally. Could Beiming Shue have beaten Yunting into thoughts of asceticism? If Yunju knew about this, who knew what she would think? Right then, a voice sounded from outside the door. "Young friend Su Zhu, I'm the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak, Lu Yun. I'm here to visit." The Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak. Su Zimo and Yunting exchanged glances in confusion, not knowing why this immortal king expert had come to visit. "Please come in." Su Zimo stood up and welcomed Lu Yun into his cave abode. When Lu Yun saw Yunting, he smiled and nodded slightly. "Peak Master Lu, do you need me to leave?" Yunting bowed and asked. Lu Yun hesitated for a moment. "There's no need for that." Thereafter, he turned to look at Su Zimo and cupped his fist slightly, saying in a deep voice, "I'm here this time round to thank you, young friend Su Zhu. Senior, you're being too polite. Why are you thanking me?" Su Zimo asked. Lu Yun said, "Thank you for imparting Beiming Shue the martial Dao, young friend. You nurtured such a peerless genius and even saved her from death." Chapter 2761, Chapter 2761, A Gift of Thanks. Chapter 2761, A Gift of Thanks. In truth, Su Zimo had always been an outsider in the years he came to the sword world. However, the people of the sword world had always treated him with respect. As an immortal king expert, the Peak Master of Carnage Sword Peak was even willing to personally thank him for Beiming Shue. Even if some sword cultivators were dissatisfied with him, they would only openly challenge him. Even if they lost, there were no plots or schemes, nor would they invite any experts to take revenge for them. Due to the upright atmosphere of the sword world, it nurtured so many open and magnanimous sword cultivators. Su Zimo smiled. Senior, you're being too polite. As Beiming's master, these are my responsibilities. Lu Yun nodded slightly and pondered for a moment. He looked at Su Zimo and said, young friend Su Zhu, there's something that might be a little presumptuous. I wonder if Senior, feel free to speak. Su Zimo said. Young friend, you're straightforward. In that case, I won't beat around the bush. Lu Yun said, Beiming Shui has already become a perfected immortal and your cultivation realm is only slightly higher than hers. I think it would be better for her if an immortal king expert imparted the Tao to her. Of course, you will still be Beiming Shui's master. There's no doubt about that. Su Zimo shook his head gently. Beiming Shui cultivates the martial Tao. Even emperor experts might not be able to guide her on the martial Tao, let alone immortal king experts. Lu Yun said, however, if I'm not wrong, you're not cultivating the martial Tao either, young friend. Yes. Su Zimo nodded. However, I'm the only one who can guide her in the martial Tao. Lu Yun hesitated. In reality, there were other reasons why he wanted to insist on his stance. However, when he saw that Su Zimo's tone was firm and difficult to sway, it would seem rude if he continued persuading. Lu Yun smiled. I was just asking casually. I hope you won't take it to heart, young friend. Naturally, Su Zimo did not mind. Lu Yun was doing this out of goodwill because he wanted Beiming Shui to become stronger. However, it was true that others could not guide Beiming Shui in the martial Tao. Lu Yun said, by the way, I'm here to thank you as a token of Carnage Sword Peak's sincerity. I've also prepared a thank you gift for you, young friend. I hope you'll accept it. Yun Ting was secretly speechless. As a peak master and a peak immortal king, Lu Yun was already very sincere by thanking him in person. To think that he even prepared a thank you gift. Senior, you're too polite. Su Zimo was about to decline when Lu Yun waved his hand gently. Young friend, don't be in a hurry to decline. Please listen to me. Young friend, I already know that you imparted the 3 great sword arts to Beiming Shui. I believe you've already cultivated the 3 great sword arts as well. Su Zimo had no intention of hiding this matter to begin with. When he saw that Beiming Shui did not suffer in the sword world and was valued instead, he had already planned to impart the 3 great sword arts to her. From a certain perspective, it was equivalent to the return of the 3 great sword arts to the sword world. Lu Yun continued, the owner of the 3 great sword arts, Emperor Immortal Vanquishing, was once the peak master of Carnage Sword Peak. Back then, he left all his sword intent on Carnage Sword Peak. The thank you gift I prepared for you is a chance to experience the sword intent of Emperor Immortal Vanquishing by going to the back of Carnage Sword Peak. As for how much you can comprehend, that will depend on your own ability. Of course, there's a prerequisite. You can't impart the sword Tao of Carnage Sword Peak to outsiders in private. A chance to experience Emperor Immortal Vanquishing's sword intent. Su Zimo was tempted. This was a rare opportunity for him. Brother Su, what are you waiting for? Agree quickly. At the side, Yun Ting sent a voice transmission with his spirit consciousness hurriedly. Under normal circumstances, those who are not from the sword world would not have the chance to experience the sword intents of the 8 sword peaks. This thank you gift is filled with sincerity. Don't worry, you don't have to have any reservations. People of the sword world do things openly and won't plot against you. At the very least, they won't harm you. Su Zimo agreed with Yun Ting. As a peak master and an immortal king expert, there was no need for Lu Yun to go through so much trouble to deal with him. However, he had a nagging feeling that Lu Yun seemed to have another motive behind the thank you gift. Lu Yun continued, young friend, you will definitely gain some insights after sensing the sword intent left behind by Emperor Immortal Vanquishing since you've cultivated the 3 great sword arts. In the future, you can also guide Beiming Shui in the Carnage Sword Tao. Alright. Su Zimo no longer declined and agreed right away. On the peak of Carnage Sword Peak. Apart from Lu Yun who was not around, the other 7 peak masters were gathered here, sipping tea and chatting. The peak master of Sever Sword Peak said, I heard that Brother Lu went to give Su Zhu a gift. The peak master of 5 Elements Sword Peak smiled. That's right. The thank you gift that Brother Lu prepared is very meaningful. What do you mean? The Peak Master of Tyrant Sword Peak was puzzled. The Peak Master of Five Elements Sword Peak explained, his allowing Suju to head to the back of Carnage Sword Peak to sense the sword intent left behind by Emperor Immortal vanquishing. It's very sincere of him indeed. However, unless one is a monster incarnate of the Sword Tao, how can ordinary cultivators comprehend the essence of the Carnage Sword intent left behind by Emperor Immortal vanquishing? Although Suju has cultivated the three great sword arts, can he compare to Beiming Shui in the Sword Tao? Beiming Shui has already cultivated the Immortal vanquishing sword to a quasi-peerless divine power level. Even after sensing the sword intent of Emperor Immortal vanquishing, she could not break through. How much can that Suju comprehend? The other Peak Masters nodded as well. As long as it was a sword cultivator of Carnage Sword Peak, they would have a chance to sense Emperor Immortal vanquishing's sword intent. However, after so many years, how many sword cultivators could comprehend the Immortal vanquishing sword? On the other hand, Lin Xuanzhen of Sever Sword Peak and Yun Ting of Extreme Sword Peak managed to cultivate the Immortal vanquishing sword to a quasi-peerless level. The Peak Master of Illusory Sword Peak said, if Suju senses nothing, he will also understand that he has no right to guide Beiming Shui in the Sword Tao. Brother Lu has put in a lot of thought into this thank you gift. The Peak Master of Fiend Sword Peak said, if Suju can realize his shortcomings and withdraw voluntarily, it can be considered as preserving his dignity as well. The Peak Master of Zen Sword Peak said, speaking of which, among the legacy disciples of this generation, Lin Xuanzhen, Beiming Shui and Yun Ting have all comprehended the Immortal vanquishing sword to a quasi-peerless level. I believe that with their talent, the three of them will be able to comprehend the true Immortal vanquishing sword in the end. However, I wonder who can control this peerless divine power first. Why don't we make bets? Suddenly, the Peak Master of Fiend Sword Peak was interested. I'll bet on Lin Xuanzhen. After all, Lin Xuanzhen's cultivation realm far surpassed Beiming Shui and Yun Ting's. She indeed had a better chance of comprehending the Immortal vanquishing sword first. Apart from the Peak Master of Fiend Sword Peak, 4 other Peak Masters of the 7 placed their bets on Lin Xuanzhen. Only one of them thought highly of Beiming Shui and the other thought highly of Yun Ting. Ha. The Peak Master of Fiend Sword Peak laughed. We'll count Brother Lu in when he returns. As everyone chatted and laughed, 3 figures sped towards Carnage Sword Peak from afar. Their leader was none other than Lu Yun. Behind him were Su Zimo and Yun Ting. Chapter 2762, Chapter 2762, Carnage Sword Intent. Chapter 2762, Carnage Sword Intent. A large number of sword cultivators were gathered beside the sword cleansing pool. Ever since Beiming Shui transcended the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation, many sword cultivators wanted to follow her cultivation method and cultivate nearby. At the front of Carnage Sword Peak was a sword chi waterfall that rumbled endlessly. Emperor Immortal vanquishing's sword intent was behind the mountain. Yun Ting bade farewell to Su Zimo here and returned to Extreme Sword Peak. Su Zimo followed Lu Yun around Carnage Sword Peak. When they arrived at the back of the mountain, the roar of the sword chi waterfall disappeared instantly. Carnage Sword Peak was like an immortal sword erected here. The front and back of the mountain peak were like 2 sides of the immortal sword, isolating 2 different worlds. There were clearly fewer sword cultivators behind the mountain of Carnage Sword Peak. Generally speaking, one could only observe and sense the sword intent left behind by Emperor Immortal vanquishing after becoming a perfected immortal. It was not that the sword world had deliberately set a threshold to make things difficult for the sword cultivators. It was because their cultivation realms were insufficient and cultivators could not withstand Emperor Immortal vanquishing's sword intent head-on. At that moment, some perfected immortals behind the mountain were calm and focused. They raised their heads slightly and looked at the sword marks left behind on the back of the mountain peak, sensing them silently. Emperor Immortal vanquishing's carnage sword intent was all contained in these sword marks. Lu Yun said softly, "Young friend Su Zhu, there's something I have to tell you in advance." The sword marks on this mountain peak were left behind by Emperor Immortal vanquishing back then. The Carnage sword intent inside will have a huge impact on the Tao heart. Even some paragons of Carnage sword peak might not be able to sit here for more than 2 hours. If you feel that something is wrong and you can't withstand it, please don't force yourself. Retreat in time and distance yourself from this Carnage sword peak. That way, you'll be able to escape the influence of the Carnage sword intent. The moment he said that, a sword cultivator not far away suddenly opened his eyes and his expression changed as he spat out a mouthful of blood. The person panted heavily with bloodshot eyes and a murderous aura. He had already lost his rationality. Lu Yun frowned slightly and waved his robe sleeve, moving the sword cultivator far away. He called out softly, "Your Tao heart is unstable. If you continue to act tough, you will only suffer." Those words seemed to be a reminder to Su Zimo as well. The sword cultivator shuddered and the blood in his eyes faded gradually, allowing him to regain consciousness. Embarrassed, the person struggled to his feet and bowed to Lu Yun before slowly retreating. "Young friend Su Zhu, you saw it too." Lu Yun turned around and said, "I don't know much about you and don't know how your Tao heart is. If you don't gain anything from sensing the Carnage sword intent, there's no need to force yourself. Your body is the most important." Su Zimo smiled. "Don't worry, senior. I know my limits." Lu Yun gave a few more reminders before turning to leave. He soared all the way to the peak of the mountain. When Su Zimo arrived before Carnage Sword Peak, he did not sit down. Instead, he stood on the spot and looked at the sword marks left behind by Emperor Immortal vanquishing. His heart skipped a beat as he held the body seed in his palm. To him, this was the best opportunity to comprehend the Immortal vanquishing sword. He could not miss it. With the body seed in his hand, his perception and comprehension increased as well. In reality, Su Zimo had cultivated the 3 great sword arts for even longer than Beiming Shui. Furthermore, he comprehended the first version of the 3 great sword arts. Beiming Shui had a sword-shaped martial spirit, talent in the sword Tao and unprecedented comprehension of the sword Tao. However, she had not been in contact with the first version ancient scrolls of the 3 great sword arts for long. Furthermore, Su Zimo possessed the body of a grade 12 creation green lotus. Be it cultivating the immortal, fiend, or Buddhist Taos, there were no obstacles to it. He could fuse them into his dharmic Tao and turn it into his own creation. It was the same for cultivating the sword Tao. The immortal vanquishing sword that Su Zimo cultivated was already at the level of a quasi-peerless divine power. Coupled with the fact that he had cultivated the 2 great sword arts for many years and accumulated them, now that he could sense the sword intent left behind by Emperor Immortal vanquishing back then, the final transformation was only a matter of time. Su Zimo had mastered many killing techniques. Not only were there the 3 great sword arts, there was also a secret skill with extremely strong killing intent like White Tiger Corpse Collection. He was no stranger to killing intent. Most importantly, Su Zimo had cultivated the Yin-Yang Talisman Sutra before. The inspiration for the 3 great sword arts created by Emperor Immortal vanquishing originated from a passage in the Yin-Yang Talisman Sutra. When the heaven's killing intent is released, the stars are shifted out of alignment. When the earth's killing intent is released, the dragon snake shall rise. When the human's killing intent is released, heaven and earth shall topple. Su Zimo had also read the complete Yin-Yang Talisman Sutra. His understanding of those words was not inferior to Emperor Immortal vanquishing. Coupled with the 3 great sword arts and the Carnage sword intent left behind by Emperor Immortal vanquishing, it was only a matter of time before Su Zimo comprehended the peerless divine power, the Immortal vanquishing sword. On the peak of the mountain. Brother Lu, make a guess. Who do you think will comprehend the Immortal vanquishing sword first, Lin Xuanzhen, Beiming Shui or Yun Ting? The few of us have already made our bets. The peak masters urged. Lu Yun shook his head gently. How can it be so easy to cultivate a peerless divine power? It's difficult for the 3 of them to comprehend it in a short period of time. Who can say for sure when such a distant matter will happen? It will probably take thousands or even tens of thousands of years for the outcome to be decided. The peak master of 5 elements Sword Peak nodded and said, "What Brother Lu said makes sense. In my opinion, Let's change our bet to something that can be decided quickly. That's easy. The Peak Master of Tyrant Sword Peak smiled and said, let's bet on how long Su Zhu can last against the sword intent of Carnage Sword Peak. All right. That's a good idea. The eyes of the other Peak Masters lit up. The Peak Master of Illusory Sword Peak said, if I remember correctly, back then, Lin Xuanzhen, Yun Ting and Beiming Shui lasted for 6 hours before they were forced to retreat. Su Zhu will definitely not be able to reach 6 hours. His Dao heart will be pretty strong if he can even sit for a full 2 hours. The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak said, I'll bet an hour. In my opinion, he can only last for 15 minutes at most. Aren't you guys looking down on him too much? I bet he can sit for a full 2 hours. The 8 Peak Masters placed their bets one after another and chatted casually as they waited. Time passed slowly. 15 minutes. An hour later. In the blink of an eye, 2 hours passed and Su Zimo was still comprehending without moving. We were all wrong. Looks like Brother Lu won. The Peak Masters exchanged glances and shook their heads with bitter smiles. Among the 8 Peak Masters, only Lu Yun guessed that Su Zimo could last for 4 hours. In reality, he did not have high expectations for Su Zimo initially as well. However, after his interaction with Su Zimo earlier on, his intuition told him that this young man was far from simple. In the blink of an eye, 4 hours passed. Su Zimo was still comprehending below. To think that this lad would be able to hold on for so long? The few of us were wrong this time round. The 8 Peak Masters still had relaxed expressions and chuckled. As time passed, the smiles on the faces of the 8 Peak Masters decreased. At that moment, 6 hours had passed and Su Zimo still showed no signs of leaving. The 8 Peak Masters exchanged glances with grim expressions. The Peak Master of 5 Elements Sword Peak said, this lad's Dao heart is indeed very strong. He's actually comparable to Lin Xuanzhen and the other 2. The other Peak Masters were silent. Right now, it was no longer a matter of standing shoulder to shoulder. If Su Zimo continued comprehending, he would have already surpassed Lin Xuanzhen and the other 2. 8 hours. Su Zimo's eyes were still closed and he was motionless. After the 10th hour, Carnage Sword Peak was already shrouded in darkness by the night. However, the 8 figures on the peak did not look tired at all. Suddenly, a commotion sounded from below. Su Zimo opened his eyes and moved. Chapter 2763, Chapter 2763, Peerless Comprehension. Chapter 2763, Peerless Comprehension. Sensing that, the 8 Peak Masters heaved a sigh of relief. He finally can't hold on any longer. Before the Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak could finish her sentence, her expression changed. Something's not right. The other Peak Masters noticed something amiss at the same time. Su Zimo did not retreat. Instead, he took a step forward from Carnage Sword Peak. Immediately after, a shuddering and terrifying killing intent burst forth from Su Zimo's body and surged into the skies. A clear sword hum sounded from his body incessantly. The terrifying killing intent from Su Zimo touched Carnage Sword Peak and even resonated with the sword marks on it. The commotion here instantly woke up the surrounding sword cultivators. The sword cultivators widened their eyes and looked at Su Zimo in horror, retreating one after another. An extremely sharp sword chi surrounded Su Zimo's body. It was sharp and murderous, many sword cultivators could not withstand it at all. The sword chi condensed with a terrifying killing intent and gathered behind Su Zimo continuously. In a blur, a phantom sword appeared with a faint blood color. I didn't expect this. I really didn't expect this. Lu Yun had a conflicted expression as he lamented, so not only does this person have a strong Dao heart, he's also talented in the sword Dao with the help of the Carnage Sword intent of Carnage Sword Peak. He actually comprehended the Immortal vanquishing sword to the level of a quasi-peerless divine power. I really don't know what this person has experienced to be able to forge such a powerful Dao heart. The Peak Master of Zen Sword Peak praised as well. The other Peak Masters were silent and merely stared fixedly at the phantom sword below. As time passed by, the sword became clearer and gradually materialized. The blood color gradually enveloped its body and became even more blinding. This is. The 8 peak masters exchanged glances and could see the shock in each other's eyes. Could it be that Suju was about to comprehend an actual peerless divine power? That was way too terrifying. Throughout history, the sword world had produced paragons and monster incarnates as well. There was no lack of people who comprehended that peerless divine power of the sword Tao. However, none of them comprehended that peerless divine power the first time they arrived at Carnage Sword Peak. If they had not seen it with their own eyes, the 8 peak masters would not have believed it. Zing. The blood-colored sword behind Suzimo had already condensed completely and emitted a cold sword hum with killing intent. The blade of the sword seemed to be stained with blood and was like a deathly blade that was extremely dazzling in the dark night. The resonance between the Immortal Vanquishing Sword and Carnage Sword Peak became clearer, and the latter even began to tremble slightly. Carnage Sword Peak was the core of Carnage Sword Continent. The vibration of the mountain instantly woke up all the sword cultivators on the continent, and they broke out of seclusion one after another. What a strong killing intent. What happened? I'm not sure. Could it be that a powerful enemy is attacking? Look over there. After the initial confusion, many sword cultivators quickly discovered the blood-colored sword that pierced into the clouds in the direction of Carnage Sword Peak and could not help but gasp. This is the Immortal Vanquishing Sword. Heavens, someone comprehended the peerless divine power, the Immortal Vanquishing Sword. Ordinary disciples might not know what had happened, but legacy disciples like Wang Dong were shocked and exclaimed when they saw that. Who is it? Who comprehended that peerless divine power? Could it be Junior Sister Beiming? That's not right. Junior Sister Beiming is cultivating in Myriad Sword Palace at this moment. It shouldn't be her. I think someone saw Yun Ting heading in that direction. When many sword cultivators saw that, they hurried to Carnage Sword Peak to take a look. On the one hand, it was out of curiosity. On the other hand, sensing the Carnage Sword intent of the Immortal Vanquishing Sword at close range was also extremely beneficial to them. On the peak of the mountain. After the initial shock, the 8 peak masters gradually calmed down. Among them, Lu Yun had the most complicated feelings. The main reason why he sent this thank you gift was because he wanted Su Zhu to realize his shortcomings and retreat after realizing that he could not impart the Tao to Beiming Shui. However, to think that this thank you gift would fulfill this person's wish. It allowed this person to take the huge leap and comprehend the peerless divine power, the Immortal Vanquishing Sword. The Peak Master of Extreme Sword Peak side. To think that the few of us would all lose. Who would have thought that an outsider would be able to comprehend the peerless divine power of our sword Dao before Lin Xuanzhen, Beiming Shui and Yun Ting? The Peak Master of Fiend Sword Peak was exasperated as well. The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak looked at Lu Yun. It's the worst for Brother Lu. I'm afraid your hopes of taking in Beiming Shui will come to naught. Lu Yun smiled bitterly. Su Zhu comprehended the Immortal Vanquishing Sword first, which meant that he was extremely talented in the sword Dao. Although his cultivation realm was slightly lower, he was fully qualified to impart the Dao to Beiming Shui. Even though he wanted to, it was no longer appropriate for him to mention taking in Beiming Shui as a disciple. Lu Yun pondered for a moment. It's a pity that this lad isn't from the sword world. If he could join the sword world, Su Zhu, Lin Xuanzhen, Beiming Shui and Yun Ting would be among the legacy disciples of this generation. Their futures would be limitless. When Lu Yun finished speaking, he noticed that the other 7 didn't react and remained silent. However, the eyes of the 7 peak masters flickered, as though they were planning something. Lu Yun instantly understood and scolded, "Hey, don't think I can't tell what you guys are up to. Su Zhu first arrived in my Carnage Sword Peak. Furthermore, his Beiming Shui's master. Even if he joins the sword world, he should join my Carnage Sword Peak." The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak shrugged gently. "That's hard to say. You even tried everything to stop him from remaining as Beiming Shui's master just now. The fact that he arrived in Carnage Sword Peak first doesn't mean that he will join your Carnage Sword Peak." The Peak Master of Extreme Sword Peak said, "I've always admired Su Zhu. Furthermore, he's Yun Ting's brother-in-law. It's the most suitable for both of them to be in extreme sword peak. He's most suited to cultivate the tyrant sword Dao. This lad has great wisdom. He'll definitely shine if he joins my Zen sword peak. Why make him cultivate the Zen sword out of nowhere? Lin Xuanzhen of my Sever sword peak doesn't have a Dao companion yet. I think the two of them are quite compatible. Your 3 sword peaks already have Lin Xuanzhen, Beiming Shui, and Yun Ting. Stop fighting with the rest of our sword peaks for him. The harmonious atmosphere of the 8 peak masters earlier on was changed suddenly. They argued with flushed faces on the mountain peak, unwilling to give in to each other. Right then, the blood-colored immortal vanquishing sword swayed slightly. At the foot of the mountain, Su Zimo grunted, as though he was enduring immense pain. His body trembled slightly and his skin cracked, oozing blood that dyed his green robes red. The 8 peak masters were not surprised by this. The reason why peerless divine powers were powerful was not only in terms of power. The first time a peerless divine power was comprehended, the power of the peerless divine power would descend and cleanse one's body and bloodline, tempering their essence spirit and Dao fruit. With that, the overall strength of the cultivator would undergo a transformation. At that moment, Su Zhu was enduring the baptism of the immortal vanquishing sword. Chapter 2764, Chapter 2764, Revival of the Green Lotuses. Chapter 2764, Revival of the Green Lotuses. Each time a peerless divine power was comprehended, they would experience the same process. However, peerless divine powers were different and the way they baptized cultivators was different as well. If one comprehended a peerless divine power like astral imprisonment, the damage to cultivators would be less and the process of baptizing the body, bloodline, essence spirit, and Dao fruit would be relatively gentle. As for the immortal vanquishing sword, it condensed a peerless carnage sword intent and had the heaviest killing power. Therefore, the impact damage to cultivators was extremely terrifying as well. If he wanted to release the peerless divine power, he had to withstand it himself and obtain the recognition of the peerless divine power first. The more Lu Yun looked at Su Zhu who was below, the more he found the latter pleasing to the eye. Right now, there was already a hint of worry in his eyes as he murmured, he comprehended the immortal vanquishing sword at the celestial being realm. The baptism of the peerless divine power is extremely damaging for him. I wonder if he can withstand it. There were 4 minor realms in the perfected one realm. Naturally, the later one comprehended the peerless divine power, the lower the risk. 4 paradise void perfected immortals, their physiques, bloodlines, essence spirits, and Dao fruits would already be cultivated to the perfected realm and maintained at the peak. Therefore, there would not be much danger if they comprehended peerless divine powers at that time. However, the 8 peak masters stared at it for a while and revealed shocked expressions. The peak master of Tyrant Sword Peak was shocked. This lad's physique is so strong. He was not severely injured even after enduring the sword chi of the immortal vanquishing sword. He only bled a little. That's right. This superficial wound is nothing for a perfected immortal. The peak master of 5 elements sword peak nodded as well. At that moment, the 8 peak masters had already begun to plan how to invite Su Zimo to join their sword peak after he received the baptism of the immortal vanquishing sword. Brother Lu. Right then, the peak master of extreme sword peak suddenly shouted. For some unknown reason, his voice even trembled. What's wrong? Lu Yun asked casually without looking up. Look. The peak master of extreme sword peak exclaimed. The peak masters could tell that there was something wrong with his tone and looked over instinctively. When the 8 of them saw everything before them, their eyes widened and their hearts skipped a beat, as though they had seen a ghost. How is that possible? The 8 peak masters lost their composure and were dumbfounded with shock. Behind them, the withered lotus flowers were gradually reviving and growing tender green spots to recover their vitality. The lotus flowers revived extremely quickly. Right in front of the 8 peak masters, their withered yellow color faded and they turned emerald green and filled with vitality. Like a spring breeze, all the lotus flowers came to life. Green lotuses swayed gently on the mountain peak and plump buds grew one after another, blooming slowly in front of the 8 peak masters. Not only did the green lotuses on the peak of Carnage Sword Peak recover their vitality, they even bloomed after a few breaths. When the 8 peak masters saw that, it was as though they were witnessing a miracle. Back then, Emperor Immortal Vanquishing scattered the lotus seeds of the creation green lotus here and planted this patch of lotus flowers. Ever since Emperor Immortal Vanquishing died and the creation green lotus shattered and disappeared, the lotus flowers on the mountain peak had never bloomed again. But now, all the green lotuses on the mountain peak had revived and bloomed. What did that mean? Am I seeing things? Even now, the peak master of Extreme Sword Peak murmured in disbelief. How could this be? The peak master of Sever Sword Peak frowned. Could it be related to Suju? The peak master of Fiend Sword Peak said, Suju only comprehended the divine power of the immortal vanquishing sword. Why would it cause the green lotuses on the mountain peak to bloom? Before this, there were also seniors of the sword world who comprehended the immortal vanquishing sword behind Carnage Sword Peak. There was no reaction from these green lotuses at that time. Lu Yun frowned and fell into deep thought. It was as though he had neglected something extremely important. Suddenly, a thought flashed through Lu Yun's mind. Prior to this, a few green lotuses on the mountain peak had undergone an abnormality and suddenly revived. That was when Beiming Shui broke through. Instinctively, Lu Yun thought that it was because of Beiming Shui's breakthrough that there was a reaction from the green lotuses. However, later on, when he called Beiming Shui to the peak of the mountain, the surrounding green lotuses did not react. As such, he disregarded that guess. Thereafter, he did not pursue the matter either. Now that Lu Yun thought about it again, he realized that he had overlooked someone, Suju. When Beiming Shui broke through, Suju seemed to have just entered the celestial being realm as well. If the revival of the green lotuses on the mountain peak was not caused by Beiming Shui, it might have been caused by Suju. Now, Suju was below and the green lotuses on the mountain peak had all recovered their vitality. Suju was involved both times. This could not be a coincidence. If there was anything in this world that could revive the green lotuses on the mountain peak and restore their life forces in a few dozen breaths, it would probably be the legendary creation green lotus. What's the name of the cultivator who possessed the body of the creation green lotus in the heavenly world previously? Lu Yun looked down at the figure below and suddenly made the connection as he asked. The peak master of Illusory Sword Peak said in a deep voice, his surname seems to be Su. However, that person has already died in the Emperor's tomb. Don't tell me that you think someone from the heavenly world with the surname Su as well. Lu Yun looked at Su Zimo's blood-stained green robes below and nodded slightly. There's no mistake. He should be that cultivator with the body of the creation green lotus. Because the baptism of his body by the immortal vanquishing sword earlier on released the bloodline aura of the creation green lotus, the green lotus seeds on the mountain peak woke up one after another when they sensed that aura. The other peak masters nodded as well. The peak master of Sever Sword Peak said, I'm afraid only the creation green lotus can make the withered lotus flowers on the mountain peak bloom in such a short period of time. The peak master of Zen Sword Peak said, in that case, there's an explanation for another matter. Previously, when Beiming Shui transcended the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation and her life was on the line, even we were helpless. However, she was saved by this lad. I'm afraid it's also because he made use of the bloodline of the creation green lotus. Creation green lotus. A bright glint flashed through the eyes of the peak master of Fiend Sword Peak. To think that the creation green lotus would come to our sword world once more in this generation. Perhaps this is the will of the heavens. Everyone. Suddenly, the peak master of Fiend Sword Peak said, back then, even Emperor Immortal Vanquishing could not nurture the creation green lotus to grade 12. But now, Suju has the body of a grade 12 creation green lotus. If it can be used well, the 8 of us have a chance of breaking through to the Emperor realm. When they heard that, the other 7 peak masters had different expressions. Some frowned, some glared angrily, some were shocked and some were expressionless. Lu Yun glared at the peak master of Fiend Sword Peak with a cold gaze and said slowly, Brother Shui, what are you talking about? Let me remind you. Although you cultivate the fiend Dao, don't lose your humanity. Suzhou is a living person. What are you thinking of doing to him? The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak frowned as well. Brother Shui, your words earlier on were indeed a little irrational. When the Peak Master of Fiend Sword Peak, Shui Mo, saw that the 7 other Peak Masters were looking at him strangely, he hurriedly explained, one was just saying it casually. It was just a fleeting thought. I won't really do anything to him. Lu Yun said in a deep voice, we've cultivated the sword Dao for many years and uphold righteousness in our hearts. We only do things with a clear conscience. We shouldn't even have such thoughts. Exactly. The other Peak Masters nodded in agreement. Chapter 2765, Chapter 2765, Super Large World. Chapter 2765, Super Large World. Lu Yun glanced around and frowned when he saw countless figures speeding over in the night. The commotion here is too great and all the sword cultivators of Carnage Sword Peak are alarmed. Let's go down and guard his surroundings. Don't let anything happen. Protecting Su Zimo was only one of the reasons. Lu Yun was also worried that something would happen to Su Zimo during the process of receiving the power of the peerless divine power, exposing the bloodline of the Green Lotus true body. This matter was of great importance and even had to be reported to the Emperor experts of Myriad Swords Palace. The 8 Peak Masters leaped down from the peak of Carnage Sword Peak at the same time. In the blink of an eye, they arrived around Su Zimo and channeled continuously, forming an impenetrable sword chi barrier around him. Not only could no living being barge in, even the gazes and spirit consciousnesses of others could not enter. Su Zimo was receiving the baptism of the Immortal vanquishing sword. However, he maintained his consciousness and could still sense the commotion around him. Su Zimo frowned slightly when he saw the 8 Peak Masters appear at the same time. He merely comprehended a peerless divine power, but the 8 Peak Masters were alarmed. This did not make sense. Thankfully, because his spirit perception did not warn him and the 8 Peak Masters did not seem to be hostile towards him. Su Zimo did not act rashly either. Young friend Su Zhu, if I'm not wrong, your bloodline should be the grade 12 creation Green Lotus. Right then, Lu Yun's voice sounded in Su Zimo's ears. Su Zimo's heart skipped a beat. Earlier on, he did bleed a little. However, it was difficult for others to determine his Green Lotus true body just by noticing the blood on his body. After all, the Green Lotus bloodline did not have any special aura and did not look any different. Su Zimo did not know what went wrong. Furthermore, he could not predict what changes would happen in the sword world if the grade 12 creation Green Lotus was exposed. In reality, Su Zimo had an extremely good impression of the sword world after interacting with it for more than 3 years. The sword cultivators of the sword world were open and above board. Even towards an outsider like him, they would always treat him with respect. Even when people challenged him in the beginning, they had always upheld the principle of a fair spar. However, there was only one single creation Green Lotus in the entire world. Furthermore, it had already grown to its peak state. How many people could remain unmoved by such a treasure? Just as Su Zimo was deep in thought, Lu Yun's voice sounded once more. Young friend Su Zhu, don't worry. The 8 of us definitely have no ill intentions towards you. You can cultivate without worry. Exactly. The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak added, the creation Green Lotus is extremely fated with our sword world. Even on account of the past Emperor Immortal vanquishing, we won't hurt you. The tone of the 2 Peak Masters was sincere, and coupled with the fact that his spirit perception did not warn him, Su Zimo gradually relaxed. In the current situation, if the 8 Peak Masters really wanted to harm him, he would not have a chance to escape. He might as well cultivate in peace and control the Immortal vanquishing sword first to complete his transformation. When Wang Dong and the other sword cultivators arrived at the back mountain of Carnage Sword Peak, they saw the 8 Peak Masters shielding a sword chi barrier. No one could see what was going on inside. What happened? Wang Dong asked in a low voice, which sword cultivator comprehended the Immortal vanquishing sword? They arrived late, and the sword cultivators who were at the foot of Carnage Sword Peak should know what had happened. A sword cultivator said, "It's junior sister Beiming's master, fellow Daoist Su Zhu." Su Zhu. Wang Dong and the other sword cultivators who came later were stunned when they heard that name. On the way over, they guessed a few names. However, no one expected that it would be Su Zhu who comprehended the immortal vanquishing sword. Is it really Su Zhu? A sword cultivator was still in disbelief. It's true. Another person replied, previously, Peak Master brought Su Zhu over. Su Zhu sensed Carnage Sword Peak for 10 hours before comprehending the peerless divine power directly. 10 hours. Wang Dong and the others were secretly speechless. The group of them could not even last 2 hours under Carnage Sword Peak. What's going on? Wang Dong looked at the 8 Peak Masters not far away and asked in a low voice, "Fellow Daoist Su Zhu comprehended the immortal vanquishing sword. Why are the 8 Peak Masters alarmed and personally came to protect him?" Half a year ago, when Beiming Shui attracted the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation, only Peak Master Lu Yun appeared. It was indeed shocking that Su Zhu could comprehend the immortal vanquishing sword. However, he was only an outsider after all. There was no need for the 8 Peak Masters to personally appear and protect him, right? I'm not sure either. A sword cultivator said, Su Zhu underwent the baptism of the peerless divine power and was slightly injured. Before long, the 8 Peak Masters appeared. Many sword cultivators were puzzled but did not think too much about it. They only thought that Su Zhu's sudden comprehension of the immortal vanquishing sword was the reason why the 8 Peak Masters valued him so much. From the looks of it, fellow Daoist Su Zhu is going to become our fellow disciple from today onwards as well. Wang Dong seemed to have seen through the intentions of the 8 Peak Masters and said with a smile, "Dawn broke." Su Zimo had just completed the baptism of the peerless divine power and his essence, qi and spirit had clearly increased by a level. He had just broken through to the celestial being realm. Due to the baptism of the peerless divine power, his cultivation realm had increased significantly as well and was comparable to 1,000 years of cultivation. Seniors, thank you for your protection. Su Zimo cupped his fists and thanked the 8 Peak Masters. Lu Yun smiled. Since you have the bloodline of the creation Green Lotus and have come to the sword world, don't worry. We'll do our best to protect you. Our sword world is a super large world within the Trichiliocosm. Although our territory is inferior to the heavenly world, our strength is not inferior. Even if that sect master of the academy can divine that you're here, we won't allow him to come to our sword world audaciously. Lu Yun's words made Su Zimo feel a sense of warmth that he had not felt for a long time. After his ascension, he was tense at all times and was hunted everywhere. Even after he entered Heaven and Earth Academy, he could not escape danger. It was only then that Su Zimo felt slightly relieved. Senior, what was this super large world that you were referring to? Su Zimo asked. Lu Yun explained, in the medium Kiliocosm, the strength of the world has little to do with the territory size. As long as there are more than 10 Emperor experts, it will be considered a super large world. For example, the heavenly world, our sword world, dragon world, light world, great wilderness, and some other ancient worlds are all included. If a world has more than 1 but less than 10 Emperor experts, it will be considered a greater world. If they only have 1 Emperor, it will be a middle world. Of course, there are also some worlds that don't even have Emperor experts presiding over them. Their overall strength is low and they are considered as lesser worlds. Pausing for a moment, Lu Yun continued, young friend Su Zhu, follow us to Myriad Sword Palace. Myriad Sword Palace? Su Zimo hesitated for a moment. That's the core of the sword world. Only legacy disciples of the sword world can head there. I'm only an outsider after all. The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak smiled. You have the creation Green Lotus bloodline and comprehended the immortal vanquishing sword. No matter how we look at it, you're not an outsider. What are we going to Myriad Sword Palace for? Su Zimo asked again. Lu Yun said, the fact that you comprehended the immortal vanquishing sword is enough to prove your talent in the sword Dao. Beiming Shui is comprehending in front of the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele of Myriad Sword Palace. You should go over and take a look too. Chapter 2766, Chapter 2766, Zenith Heaven Sword Classic. Chapter 2766, Zenith Heaven Sword Classic. The Zenith Heaven Sword Steely. Su Zimo was surprised. He learned from Beiming Shui that the taboo mystic classic of the sword world was engraved on the Zenith Heaven Sword Steely. Even with Beiming Shui's talent back then, she was not qualified to head to Myriad Sword Palace to comprehend the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic before becoming a legacy disciple. As for him, he was just an outsider to the sword world. Up till now, he had yet to reveal any intention of joining the sword world. Su Zimo shifted his gaze to the other peak masters. The other peak masters were not surprised either, as though they had long known of this decision. In reality, the 8 peak masters were not at the level where they could make the decision for him to comprehend the Zenith Heaven Sword Steely. The moment Lu Yun found out that Su Zimo possessed the creation Green Lotus, he sent a message to Myriad Sword Palace to report the matter to the emperors of the sword world. Before long, Myriad Sword Palace replied that Lu Yun and the others were to bring Su Zimo to Myriad Sword Palace to comprehend the Zenith Heaven Sword Steely. The emperors of the sword world had a simplistic view of the whole matter. Naturally, it would be best if Su Zimo could join the sword world. However, even if he refused, the sword world would do its best to protect him. The fact that they allowed Su Zimo to comprehend the Zenith Heaven Sword Steely could be considered a grand gesture of goodwill with him. How sharp were the emperors of the sword world? They were certain that Su Zimo would definitely be one of the top experts of the upper world in the future. Su Zimo pondered for a moment and agreed before long. Nobody could remain unmoved by a taboo mystic classic on the Zenith Heaven Sword Steely. Furthermore, when the creation Green Lotus advanced to grade 12, it gave birth to an extremely sharp duckweed sword. If he could comprehend something in front of the Zenith Heaven Sword Steely, his combat strength would increase by another level with the duckweed sword in hand. Also, he was Beiming Shui's master. Merely imparting the martial Dao would not be enough. If he could guide Beiming Shui in the sword Dao as well, it would be extremely beneficial for the latter's future. The 8 peak masters brought Su Zimo to the teleportation formation of Carnage Sword Peak and teleported to Myriad Sword Palace. The moment he arrived, Su Zimo could sense that this place was different from the 8 sword peaks. The sword chi here was even richer and more violent. If one was not at the perfected Immortal realm, it would be difficult for them to reside within Myriad Sword Palace. The territory of Myriad Sword Palace was much smaller than the continents of the 8 sword peaks. This place was built with tens of thousands of gigantic palaces joined together. There were multiple floors and pavilions that spanned thousands of kilometers, and it was an extremely spectacular sight looking down from above. There were old and new palaces in the group. The oldest palace was already dilapidated and was filled with traces of the flames of war and time. It was unknown what it had experienced back then. The reason why the sword chi in Myriad Sword Palace was so dense and complicated was because every single palace emitted its unique sword chi. If one were to sense it carefully, the sword intent contained in every palace would be completely different. Noticing the surprise in Su Zimo's eyes, Lu Yun explained, "The palaces preserved here are the cultivation cave abodes of every immortal king and even emperors in the history of the sword world. Some palaces have existed for a few eras and can be traced further than even Great Emperor Zenith Heaven. As for the owners of these palaces, if they died of old age in the sword world in the end, they would leave their dharmic Dao sword intent in their cave abodes as a form of inheritance." Su Zimo nodded. There was a similar situation in the Buddhist monasteries. Some eminent monks of the Buddhist monasteries would pass down their dharmic Daos as relics after they passed away. The peak master of Sever Sword Peak looked at the gigantic palaces below with a rueful expression. After Great Emperor Zenith Heaven died, the sword world suffered a calamity and was almost destroyed. Fortunately, these palaces were spared in the end and gradually developed to their current size. Su Zimo frowned slightly when he heard that, and a puzzled look flashed through his mind. Logically speaking, in Great Emperor Zenith Heaven's era, the sword world was definitely the strongest world of the Trichilia chasm. Even if Great Emperor Zenith Heaven exhausted his lifespan and died, which faction could threaten the foundation of the sword world to the point where it was almost destroyed? Furthermore, ever since he ascended to the upper world, Zimo had always been puzzled. Human monarch Lin Zhon had once mentioned that the trichiliocosm was divided into minor, medium and major chiliocosms. To be precise, the so-called upper world referred to the medium chiliocosm. Up till this point of his ascension, he had never heard of anyone ascending to the major chiliocosm. Where was the major chiliocosm and how should one ascend? In fact, Zimo had once suspected if there was a major chiliocosm. That was because he had encountered the tombs of 3 great emperors in the upper world. Could it be that one could not ascend to the major chiliocosm even at the great emperor realm? If even great emperors could not do it, who could? The words of the Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak indirectly confirmed something. Back then, Great Emperor Zenith Heaven did not manage to ascend to the major chiliocosm either. Of course, there were traces and clues of the major chiliocosm in the upper world. According to Immortal Queen Ling Long's speculation, there was a high chance that the creation Green Lotus came from the major chiliocosm. There was a high chance that the words on the Yin-Yang Talisman Sutra came from a civilization of the major chiliocosm. Seniors. Zimo was silent for a long time before suddenly asking. Great Emperor Zenith Heaven was already at the peak of the upper world with his cultivation. Even so, he couldn't head to the major chiliocosm. When they heard that question, the 8 Peak Masters revealed a hint of confusion and fell silent. After a while, Lu Yun shook his head gently. We don't know much about the major chiliocosm either. We've only heard rumors that a specific opportunity is required before one can head there. A specific opportunity? Zimo was even more puzzled. The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak said, without the specific opportunity, it's probably impossible to head to the major chiliocosm even if you become a great emperor. Zimo did not ask further. From the looks of it, even experts at the Immortal King realm could not come into contact with the major chiliocosm. We're here. Right then, the 8 Peak Masters brought Zimo to a tall sword stele. The shape of the sword stele was completely like an immortal sword stabbed into the ground. There were small vertical words engraved on the broad blade of the sword. There were 4 words written on the hilt, Zenith Heaven Sword Classic. In front of the Zenith Heaven Sword stele, there was another woman who was comprehending the Dharmic Tao with her eyes closed. It was Beiming Shui. Beiming Shui was in a meditative state and was so focused that she did not even notice the arrival of Zimo and the others. Zimo's gaze swept across the Zenith Heaven Sword stele and his heart skipped a beat. The words on the Zenith Heaven Sword stele looked familiar. In the secret pavilion of Heaven and Earth Academy, he had once unintentionally seen an ancient and tattered piece of white paper with the words Sword Classic at the top. The words on the Zenith Heaven Sword stele were almost identical to the words on the Sword Classic. Could it be that what's recorded on that incomplete page is a part of the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic? Zimo stood on the Zenith Heaven Sword stele and looked over attentively. Indeed, he found a few lines of words on the Zenith Heaven Sword stele that were identical to the words on the incomplete page. Chapter 2767, Chapter 2767, The Sword Stele Hums Again. Chapter 2767, The Sword Stele Hums Again. Back when Zimo obtained the Sword Classic, he could sense that the sutra on the incomplete page was profound and complicated. It was probably from an extremely high-grade cultivation technique. At that time, he had once used the spirit consonance art and the 2 true bodies read the incomplete page of the Sword Classic at the same time. Although he had some comprehension, it was impossible for him to comprehend any Dharmic Tao with just an incomplete sutra. If the 2 true bodies could not comprehend it, it was even more impossible for others. Otherwise, the incomplete page would not have been casually placed in the secret pavilion of the Academy. Now that Zimo had the chance to comprehend the complete Zenith Heaven Sword Classic, the feeling was completely different. Back then, he had many questions after reading the incomplete Sword Classic. At that moment, he had a hint of comprehension. Zimo looked at the Zenith Heaven Sword stele with a deep gaze. Holding the body seed in his hand, he gradually immersed himself. There was naturally no need to talk about the words Sword Classic 1 at the back of the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic. Zenith Heaven referred to the vast envelopment of everything. This sword classic was an all-encompassing greater mastery of the sword Tao. Therefore, every sword cultivator who came to the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele to comprehend the sword classic could comprehend different sword Taos according to their different dharmic Taos. Although Bei Ming Shui cultivated under Carnage Sword Peak, her sword Tao was independent and was clearly different from the 8 sword Taos of the sword world. Back when Bei Ming Shui transcended the 9 of 9 heavenly tribulation, her sword Tao had already taken form. To her, comprehending the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic this time round was an opportunity to establish her personal sword Tao. Up till this point of his cultivation, Su Zimo had not spent too much time and energy on the sword Tao. His cultivation was complex and involved the immortal, Buddhist, fiend, and demon Taos. The sword Tao was merely one of the branches within. The thing he had come into contact the most with was the 3 great sword arts. When the 3 sword arts were comprehended to their limits, the Carnage Sword Tao would be born. For him, he had the greatest chance and easiest comprehension of the Carnage Sword Tao. Similarly, there were thousands of profundities in the sword Tao. However, Carnage was undoubtedly the profundity that could represent the sword Tao the most. Su Zimo and Bei Ming Shui stood and sat in front of the Zenith Heaven Sword Stele. Sword Qi circled their bodies as they looked at the same sword classic of the sword Tao and comprehended different sword Tao profundities. Bei Ming Shui's aura became deeper and more mysterious. She was like a black hole in the cosmos, absorbing and devouring continuously. As for Su Zimo's aura, it became stronger, sharper, and filled with killing intent. Lu Yun nodded to himself when he saw that. The killing sword intent revealed by Su Zimo was extremely pure. Furthermore, he had already comprehended the Immortal vanquishing sword first. There was a high chance that he would advance further in the Carnage Sword Tao after comprehending the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic. As for Bei Ming Shui, her sword Tao was a little strange, something that even the 8 peak masters had never seen before. Right now, Su Zimo could be compared to an unsheathed sword with an oppressive sharpness such that no one could ignore his existence. However, Bei Ming Shui was surrounded by nothingness. It was as though all matter had been devoured by her sword Tao and vanished. From the looks of it, Bei Ming Shui might be creating a new sword Tao. The Peak Master of Sever Sword Peak sent a voice transmission with her spirit consciousness. Lu Yun nodded slightly. Bei Ming Shui specializes in the sword Tao and should be even more talented than her master. Pausing for a moment, Lu Yun continued, however, comprehending a new sword Tao is as difficult as ascending to the heavens. Bei Ming Shui's cultivation realm, vision, and knowledge are far from enough. I wonder if she'll succeed this time round. None of the 8 peak masters left. Instead, they guarded this place to prevent outsiders from disturbing them. The 8 of them used their spirit consciousnesses to communicate as well. In reality, Lu Yun was right. Bei Ming Shui's foundation was the martial Tao and her martial spirit was the sword. In terms of talent in the sword Tao, she was indeed superior to Su Zimo's Green Lotus true body. However, Su Zimo's foundation was way too strong. The creation Green Lotus was inclusive to begin with. Even if it cultivated the immortal, Buddhist, fiend, and demon Taos at the same time, it would not be affected. More importantly, when the martial Tao prime body underwent the 10th tribulation, a humanoid heavenly tribulation in the form of a sword cultivator descended with a terrifying sword Tao. If he was not wrong, the human figure conjured by the heavenly tribulation was Great Emperor Zenith Heaven of the Pass. In other words, Su Zimo had personally witnessed Great Emperor Zenith Heaven use his sword Tao. Not only that, he had even fought Great Emperor Zenith Heaven before and experienced his sword Tao personally. As Su Zimo compared the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic before him to that situation back then, it was equivalent to Great Emperor Zenith Heaven personally imparting the sword Tao to him. The Zenith Heaven Sword Classic was a taboo mystic classic after all and was the most mysterious and complicated. Even if Bei Ming Shui came here for seclusion first, given her talent, it was impossible for her to comprehend anything in a short period of time. Bei Ming Shui closed her eyes and frowned slightly, as though she was deeply confused. Although Su Zimo had an image of Great Emperor Zenith Heaven executing the sword Tao back then, there were still some questions when he compared it to the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic. Right then, Suzimo's heart skipped a beat. In his consciousness, the green lotus essence spirit extended his palm. Sensing it, a green glow appeared and floated before him. It was the fourth treasure derived from the creation green lotus, the duckweed sword. The green lotus essence spirit held the duckweed sword in his hands. The green lotus essence spirit shuddered. Instantly, his spirit perception, understanding and comprehension of the sword Tao seemed to have increased by several times. The profundity of the duckweed sword began to take effect. Suzimo held the body seed in his hand. In his consciousness, the green lotus essence spirit held the duckweed sword and recalled the scene of Great Emperor Zenith Heaven executing the Zenith Heaven sword Tao. When he compared it to the Zenith Heaven sword classic before him, he felt enlightened. The confusion from earlier on was resolved. Buzz! The Zenith Heaven sword steely shuddered and the sword hums sounded once more, reverberating through the world, causing the 8 sword peaks and myriad sword palace to tremble. What happened? I'm not sure. It seems to be from the direction of myriad sword palace. Could junior sister Beiming have comprehended something again? Countless sword cultivators broke out of seclusion and looked in the direction of the hum. In the direction of myriad sword palace, incomparably powerful spirit consciousnesses enveloped down instantly. The few old fellows of the sword world were alarmed. How long had it only been? The Zenith Heaven sword steely hummed once more. In Suzimo's eyes, the words on the Zenith Heaven sword steely seemed to have separated from the sword steely. Every single stroke of the words were sword marks that represented a sword intent. It was as though a figure executed a peerless sword Tao on the Zenith Heaven sword steely and moved gracefully like an amazing dragon, leaving behind those marks. Suzimo was immersed in his comprehension and his mind was wandering. However, he did not know that the 8 peak masters around him were staring at him in disbelief with widened eyes. Even Beiming Shui, who was at the side, had already awakened from her comprehension. Her comprehension had already reached a bottleneck and could not continue. Right then, she heard a clear sword hum in her ears. Instinctively, she opened her eyes and saw a shocking scene. Suzimo's eyes were closed and he wielded the duckweed sword. It was as though he had fallen into a strange state as he danced in front of the Zenith Heaven sword steely with a graceful posture and profound sword technique. Every single strike left a sword mark in midair that gradually entered the Zenith Heaven sword steely and fused perfectly with the words on it. Beiming Shui was shocked when she saw Suzimo's sword Tao. As though she had comprehended something, the bottleneck she had just encountered loosened as well. Chapter 2768, Chapter 2768, Sword Burial. Chapter 2768, Sword Burial. The sword Tao that Suzimo released was perfectly compatible with the Dharmic Tao of the Zenith Heaven sword classic, as though Great Emperor Zenith Heaven had been reborn. Beiming Shui was not the only one. Even the 8 peak masters were enlightened and moved when they witnessed that scene personally. In reality, the cultivation and sword Tao realms of the 8 peak masters far surpassed Suzimo. However, at that moment, Suzimo was clearly in a strange state, as though Great Emperor Zenith Heaven had possessed him and perfectly reproduced the Dharmic Tao of the Zenith Heaven sword Tao. The scene before them was as though Great Emperor Zenith Heaven was imparting the Tao personally. Swish, swish, swish. Suddenly, a figure appeared in midair. He had a pale face and wore an iron crown on his head. His eyes were turbid and he looked gloomy. He seemed to be extremely old, as though he would die at any moment. However, the old man's body was straight and he stood in midair like a sharp sword that stood between the world with an oppressive sharpness. Greetings. When the 8 peak masters saw the iron crown old man appear, they shuddered and hunched down hurriedly, prepared to bow. The iron crown old man waved his hand gently, indicating that they did not have to say anything. His gaze was fixed on Suzimo, who was dancing with his sword the entire time, and a sword glint flashed through his turbid eyes from time to time. The 8 peak masters exchanged glances and were secretly speechless. To think that such a huge commotion would happen today, that even this emperor of the sword world was alarmed and appeared here. Although the iron crown old man was extremely old, his cultivation had long reached the peak of the emperor realm. He was also one of the most senior and highest-ranking decision-makers in the sword world. There were clearly auras of Emperor experts in the other directions as well. Although the emperors of the sword world did not appear, they were paying attention to everything that happened from afar. With the duckweed sword in hand, every time Suzumo executed a sword dao, a sword beam would enter the zenith heaven sword stele and overlap with the strokes of the words on it. Because of that, the zenith heaven sword stele would also emit a buzzing sword hum that lingered incessantly. The 8 peak masters, including the Iron Crown Old Man and the other emperor experts who did not appear in Myriad Sword Palace, had different insights when they saw that. The zenith heaven sword stele hummed continuously for 2 hours. Half a year ago, when Beiming Shui's tribulation transcendence caused the sword stele to hum, it only lasted for less than an hour. Suzumo's sword dance became slower and slower. The sword dao of the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic became more and more profound towards the end. Even though he had personally witnessed Great Emperor Zenith Heaven's sword dao, it was difficult for him to execute it with his current cultivation realm. Finally, Suzumo stopped and sat cross-D. He placed the duckweed sword horizontally across his knees and did not wake up from his epiphany. On the other side, through her earlier comprehension, Beiming Shui's sword dao had already taken form. Although she was only at the convergence realm, her sword dao cultivation had improved and her combat strength had increased. Beiming Shui retreated slowly from the Zenith Heaven sword stele without alarming Suzumo. Lu Yun frowned slightly. Suzumo was not in a good state. The Zenith Heaven Sword Classic contained thousands of sword daos and no one could control all of them. Even Great Emperor Zenith Heaven back then only achieved this after cultivating to the Great Emperor realm. However, Suzumo was only a celestial being perfected immortal. Initially, the sword chi on Suzumo's body was extremely pure. The sword chi that was derived from the 3 great sword arts could only comprehend the Carnage Sword Dao. Now, because he had just used the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic, the sword chi on Suzumo's body had become extremely mixed. There was the Carnage Sword Dao, the Zen Sword Dao and the 5 Elements Sword Dao. Hundreds of thousands of sword dao auras burst forth from Suzumo's body and clashed continuously, not giving in to each other. His aura became extremely unstable as well, rising and falling. His body trembled slightly, as though he was in immense pain. Lu Yun and the others looked at the old man instinctively. The situation Suzumo was facing now was extremely dangerous. If he did not handle it well, hundreds and thousands of sword daos would burst forth from his body. The terrifying power was enough to tear Suzumo into pieces. The Iron Crown Old Man had a grim expression and pondered for a moment. He merely shook his head gently, indicating for the 8 peak masters to not act rashly and continue watching. In reality, if it was anyone else, the Iron Crown Old Man would have stepped in long ago and interrupted the person. However, Suzumo had the body of a grade 12 creation green lotus after all and might produce other creations. It was not easy for him to judge and he could only wait and see. Right then, Suzumo's aura changed. Gradually, his body emitted a dark and cold power. He exuded a declining aura that reeked of death. The Fiend Dao. The 8 peak masters' hearts skipped a beat. The aura that Suzumo was emitting now was clearly not of the immortal and Buddhist Dharmic formulations. The eyes of the peak master of Fiend Sword Peak lit up and he was secretly delighted. If Suzumo chose the Fiend Sword Dao, there was a chance that he would join Fiend Sword Peak. However, before long, the 8 peak masters realized that something was amiss. Under normal circumstances, the Fiend Sword Dao was comparable to other sword daos. At that moment, the other sword daos in Suzumo's body seemed to be devoured or even buried by the pitch-black fiend chi. The 8 peak masters seemed to have an illusion. Suzumo, who was sitting cross-D before them, seemed to have transformed into a tomb with thousands of sword daos buried within. A shuddering burial intent exuded from Suzumo's body and expanded continuously, enveloping the entire Myriad Sword Palace. Not only did he want to bury the thousands of sword daos, he wanted to bury the entire Myriad Sword Palace. The expression of the Iron Crown Old Man changed. He merely dazed off for a moment and Myriad Sword Palace seemed to have turned into a gigantic tomb. The Myriad Sword Daos transformed into many swords that stabbed into the tomb, turning it into a gigantic sword tomb that was lifeless. The sword tomb could not only bury everything, it could also tear everything apart. Pest! The Iron Crown old man shuddered and snapped out of his stupor instantly, shocked. What a terrifying sword intent! Even the Zenith Heaven sword Steely began to sink into the darkness under the sword intent. This lad wants to bury all the sword dows. The Iron Crown old man was secretly speechless. Such boldness. In reality, Suzimo had no choice. He had just released the Zenith Heaven Sword Classic and thousands of sword dows were derived within his body. They were in conflict and it was difficult to resolve the situation. However, it would be a pity if he cultivated only one sword dao and abandoned everything else. Right then, he thought of a taboo mystic classic, Heaven Burial Sutra. The Heaven Burial Sutra was known as the Tomb of the Heavens and all types of living beings were buried. He tried to use the profundity of the Heaven Burial Sutra to bury the thousands of sword dows, gradually forming the current situation where a brand new sword dao was derived, the Sword Burial Dao. In a sense, the Sword Burial Dao was equivalent to the synthesis of the two taboo mystic classics, the Heaven Burial Sutra and Zenith Heaven Sword Classic. That was why such a terrifying scene was formed at the birth of the Sword Burial Dao. It even caused the 8 Peak Masters and the Iron Crown Old Man to hallucinate for a moment. Chapter 2769, Chapter 2769, Ninth Sword Peak. Chapter 2769, Ninth Sword Peak. This sword intent spread continuously. Not only did it envelop the countless ancient and gigantic palaces in the surroundings, it continued to spread. The aura of death was like a smear of ink that enveloped the 8 sword peaks. Before long, even the 8 sword peaks disappeared into the lifeless darkness. The entire sword world seemed to be buried in a gigantic tomb. Instantly, all the sword cultivators of the 8 sword peaks stopped what they were doing and froze on the spot. At the same time, they felt their hearts palpitate, as though they were buried alive under a tomb by an invisible force and could not breathe. There was an extremely terrifying power hidden in the tomb. An extreme sharpness that seemed to be able to tear through everything and destroy everything. That sharpness was right beside everyone and could tear them into pieces at any moment. What a powerful sword intent! The 8 Peak Masters were shocked. The scene before them was far more shocking than Suzimo's sword dance earlier on. However, before long, Suzimo seemed to be unable to withstand such a powerful sword intent. His body swayed slightly and his face turned incomparably pale. He woke up from his epiphany and opened his eyes, panting heavily. Not far away, the Iron Crown Old Man looked at Suzimo deeply. To be able to withstand such a terrifying sword intent and envelop the entire sword world, there was no way this lad's essence spirit cultivation was at the celestial being realm. Furthermore, this could only be done by a sufficiently condensed and powerful essence spirit. This lad is hiding his strength. Seems like he's much stronger than he appears. The Iron Crown Old Man thought to himself. When Suzimo opened his eyes, he saw the 8 Peak Masters who were dumbfounded and had completely lost their composure not far away. There was also an old man with an iron crown who stood in midair with a pale face. So strong. Suzimo's heart skipped a beat. Although the Iron Crown Old Man did not release any sword intent, he felt an indescribable pressure in front of the old man. This feeling was something that he had only experienced before from an expert like Bo-Zun. An Emperor Realm expert. Suzimo had not expected that his enlightenment in front of the Zenith Heaven Sword Steely would alarm an Emperor expert. Thank you for granting me this opportunity, seniors. Suzimo thanked the 8 Peak Masters and cupped his fists towards the Iron Crown Old Man not far away. The Iron Crown Old Man descended slowly and stood on the ground like Suzimo. The condescending pressure from earlier on had faded significantly as well. He waved his hand gently and formed a sword chi barrier around him, enveloping Suzimo, the 8 Peak Masters and Beiming Shui. Not only could the sword chi barrier isolate sound, even the spirit consciousnesses of the other emperors of the sword world could not permeate it. Suju isn't your real name, right? The Iron Crown Old Man asked. Suzimo looked at Lu Yun and the others before nodding slightly. Suzimo immediately understood that the Iron Crown Old Man must already know his identity as the creation Green Lotus. Since that was the case, there was no need for him to hide it. Suzumo nodded and said, "I'm Suzumo. I was chased by my enemies because of my Green Lotus bloodline and had no choice but to hide my real name. Seniors, please forgive me. It's only right." The Iron Crown Old Man said, "It's better for you to be careful before you can protect yourself." Pausing for a moment, the Iron Crown Old Man suddenly said, "Young friend, since you fled here, you can be considered fated with our sword world. Furthermore, your disciple and old friend is also here. I wonder if you'd be willing to join the sword world." The 8 Peak Masters exchanged glances and were secretly speechless. Given the Iron Crown Old Man's status, he actually invited Suzumo to join the sword world personally and addressed a perfected immortal as his young friend so politely. Suzumo was stunned as well. Naturally, he had thought of this before. However, he did not expect that an Emperor expert would appear to invite him. Beiming Shue's initially calm eyes fluctuated slightly with a hint of anticipation. Suzumo remained silent. After the incident at Heaven and Earth Academy, he subconsciously felt wary and resistant towards joining any sect or faction. Although the sect master of the academy looked studious and spoke of benevolence, he was extremely scheming and ruthless. Even now, he still felt a lingering fear when he thought about it. When his scheme was exposed, the sect master of the academy still carried a smile and recounted his kindness towards Suzumo, explaining that it was for the latter's own good. However, in reality, there was only one goal behind every single sentence of the sect master of the academy: to take advantage of him. Not only did the sect master of the academy want to take advantage of Suzumo, he wanted the latter to be grateful for it. "Do you have any concerns?" As though he had seen through something, the Iron Crown Old Man said, "Don't worry, no one is to tell anyone about your true identity as well as the matter of the creation Green Lotus." The Iron Crown Old Man looked at the 8 Peak Masters. "The 8 of you are not allowed to tell anyone else about this, including the other emperors of the sword world." The 8 Peak Masters' hearts skipped a beat as they nodded one after another. The fact that the Iron Crown Old Man wanted it hidden even from the other emperors of the sword world showed his sincerity. Suzumo was silent for a moment. "Even if I join the sword world now, I might leave one day. I wonder." "It's fine." The Iron Crown Old Man smiled. "Joining the sword world will not restrict your freedom. No matter where you go in the future or what faction you create, it's up to you." "All right." Suzumo no longer hesitated and agreed. For the past few years, the environment of the sword world, the atmosphere of cultivation and the many sword cultivators he came into contact with made him have a good impression of them. The feeling that the Iron Crown Old Man in front of him gave him was completely different from the sect master of the academy. The sect master of the academy was like an unfathomable dark abyss that no one could see through. As for the Iron Crown Old Man in front of him, his figure was like a sword and his clothes were open. His gaze was frank, making Suzumo feel even more at ease. When she heard Suzumo agree, Beiming Shui smiled as well. The two of them were only master and disciple. However, Beiming Shui had a different feeling towards Suzumo, as though she was relying on him like a father. She had never had any other thoughts. She merely wanted to stay by Suzumo's side and cultivate. She would be satisfied with that. The 8 Peak Masters were energized as well, becoming excited. Suzumo had already decided to join the sword world. Whoever could invite Suzumo to join their sword peak would definitely be much stronger. The 8 Peak Masters looked at Suzumo expectantly and tried their best to signal with their eyes. If not for the fact that the Iron Crown Old Man was present, they would probably have reached out to grab him directly. The Iron Crown Old Man hollered angrily, "Why are the few of you winking? Do you want Suzu to become your disciple? What else?" The 8 Peak Masters were stunned. Lu Yun coughed gently. "Young friend Suzu is not an immortal king after all. He can't join Myriad Sword Palace directly or that'll be breaking the rules." "Of course." The Iron Crown Old Man nodded slightly. Lu Yun continued, "If he won't be joining our 8 Sword Peaks nor Myriad Sword Palace, where else could he go? Unless..." He seemed to have thought of something and stopped abruptly. The expressions of the other 7 peak masters changed as well. The Iron Crown Old Man said slowly, "The Sword World will establish a 9th sword peak for Suju that's comparable to the 8 sword peaks. Suju will be the peak master of the 9th sword peak." Chapter 2770, Chapter 2770, Good Karma. Chapter 2770, Good Karma. Although the 8 peak masters had already guessed that, the 8 of them were still shocked when they heard it from the Iron Crown Old Man. A 9th sword peak. The 8 peak masters exchanged glances and smiled bitterly. Earlier on, they were still thinking about how to get Suzumo to be their disciple. Now, there was no need for them to fight anymore. Suzumo was the peak master of the 9th sword peak. This could also show how highly the Iron Crown Old Man regarded Suzumo. Not only did he personally invite him, he even wanted to establish a single sword peak for him. With a smile on his face, Lu Yun couldn't help but tease, "Good lord, what a meteoric rise. He's now on par with the few of us." "That's right." The peak master of Sever Sword Peak smiled as well. "We have to be careful in the future and not address him as young friend anymore." The 2 peak masters spoke in a relaxed tone and joked, clearly harboring no ill intentions towards Suzumo. Even though Suzumo was about to become the peak master of the 9th sword peak with his perfected immortal cultivation realm and was comparable to them, there was no displeasure or resistance on the faces of the 8 peak masters. Instead, they were happy for Suzumo. Bei Ming Shui, who had a calm expression the entire time, opened her mouth instinctively in disbelief when she heard the Iron Crown Old Man's decision. In the blink of an eye, her master had become the peak master of a sword peak. Among the legacy disciples of this generation, the 3 successors that the sword world valued the most were her, Yun Ting and Lin Xuanzhen. However, no matter how much the 3 of them were valued, it was not to this extent. Such treatment for Suzumo was probably unprecedented in the history of the sword world. Suzumo was surprised as well. Initially, he thought that he would be a normal legacy disciple after joining the sword world. To think that the Iron Crown Old Man would make such a heavy promise. Suzumo cupped his fists. "Senior, I'm extremely grateful for your good intentions. However, my cultivation is insufficient and I'm still inexperienced. To make me a peak master directly, wouldn't that be?" He was not pretending to be polite, but that was the truth. It had only been slightly more than 3 years since he arrived at the sword world. The moment he agreed to join the sword world, he became the peak master of a sword peak. There was no way he could convince the masses. The peak masters of the 8 sword peaks were all peak immortal kings. Even as a perfected immortal, he was only at the celestial being realm. Among the perfected immortals of the sword world, many sword cultivators were above him. For example, Lin Xuanzhen, who was known as the #1 legacy disciple, was more qualified than him no matter how he looked at it. Unexpectedly, before Suzumo could finish, the Iron Crown Old Man waved his hand. "In our sword world, background and qualifications don't matter. Your cultivation realm is a little low, but just that sword intent earlier on is enough for you to become the peak master of the 9th sword peak." The 8 peak masters nodded as well. They had just experienced that terrifying sword intent personally and still felt a lingering fear when they recalled it. Suzumo was still hesitant. Apart from the sword burial Tao that he had just comprehended, there was probably another reason why he could become the peak master of the 9th sword peak, his Green Lotus true body. However, no one else knew about this and the Iron Crown Old Man would not permit them to spread it either. When the other sword cultivators heard that he had become the peak master of the 9th sword peak, they would definitely be indignant. At that time, there would definitely be some trouble. The Iron Crown Old Man continued, "Don't worry, this matter is settled. No one can challenge your status. Furthermore, we can't keep a low profile about this matter. We have to hold a grand event and let the name of the 9th sword peak spread so that the surrounding worlds will know who the peak master of the 9th sword peak is." Suzumo was dumbfounded. Lu Yun explained with a smile, "This is the good intentions of my master. Our sword world is a super large world. Your status as a peak master shall be your protection talisman. If anyone dares to lay a hand on you using their statuses or powers unfairly, the factions and worlds backing them would have to think carefully about the consequences. Lu Yun's last sentence was filled with killing intent. In reality, that was also the case. Peak Masters were not ordinary legacy disciples. If an immortal king expert crossed a major cultivation realm to attack Su Zimo, it would be equivalent to breaking a hidden rule. The Sword World would have every reason to retaliate and take revenge. Even immortal king experts of other super-large worlds would have to think twice before attacking Su Zimo, let alone lesser worlds and middle worlds. Of course, fights between those of the same cultivation realm were other matters. In the opinion of the Iron Crown Old Man, although Su Zimo's cultivation realm was only at the celestial being realm, he should be able to protect himself against Paradise Void perfected immortals with his Green Lotus true body. Now that he was given the status of the Peak Master of the Ninth Sword Peak, Su Zimo could do whatever he wanted in many world. Anyone who dared to touch him had to think about the Sword World behind him. Congratulations, 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 Brother Su. The other Peak Masters went forward to congratulate him. At this point, Su Zimo could not decline any longer and could only agree shamelessly. He smiled bitterly. I'm new here and don't know anything about being a Peak Master. Please guide me in the future, seniors. Man. The Peak Master of Tyrant Sword Peak said, Brother Su, since you're a Peak Master, you can just address us as fellow brothers. As for the matter of the Peak Master, there's no rush. Once the Ninth Sword Peak is established, everything will naturally fall into place. Lu Yun nodded as well. It's not so easy to open up a new Sword Peak and there are many implications. It will probably take hundreds or even thousands of years. Brother Su, don't worry, you can slowly familiarize yourself with it. That long? Su Zimo was shocked. In a flash, the Iron Crown Old Man returned to his cultivation ground in the blink of an eye. Compared to the other palaces, the cultivation place of the Iron Crown Old Man was extremely simple and crude. There was only a simple straw hut. The Iron Crown Old Man pushed the door open and entered. Mist rose in the straw hut and the fragrance of tea wafted into one's nose. The vague figures of two other old men with white hair, one fat and one thin, could be seen drinking tea leisurely. When they saw the Iron Crown Old Man return, the fat and thin old man gave him a thumbs up at the same time and praised him. Iron Head, you're really something. In order to retain that kid's sword burial inheritance, you're actually willing to open up a ninth sword peak for him. Amateurs. The Iron Crown Old Man pursed his lips in disdain at the two old men's praise. Why? Did you have any other considerations? The fat old man asked. The Iron Crown Old Man did not answer. He came to the middle of the two old men and sat down. He received a cup of fragrant tea that had just been brewed and drank it in one gulp. He closed his eyes and savored it carefully before heaving a long sigh. The Iron Crown Old Man opened his eyes and said slowly, The most important thing for me to let him stay in the sword world is to establish good karma with him. Even if he leaves in the future, he won't become enemies with the sword world. If the sword world is in trouble in the future, perhaps this good karma will be a chance of survival for the sword world. When they heard the last sentence, the two old men seemed to have thought of something and sighed deeply with rueful expressions. You're tuning in to the Celestial War YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories,